Can you hear us now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I was just doing my introductory hand waving, so you didn't miss anything substantial. But of course, everything I say is very important. Yeah, this afternoon, if we can talk about the specific proposals and see if we can resolve on one of them as the starting point for the vocabulary, that'll enable us to go to the list with a call for adoption and try and get consensus on that. And then if we're able to do that in a reasonable amount of time, we can start identifying the things that people want to talk about in that draft and what would need to be changed or removed or added or considered before we're comfortable shipping that as a product to the working group. So as far as I'm aware, we really have two proposals on the table for the vocabulary. We have the Open Future proposal from Paul, and then we have Tom's proposal from Come and Crawl. And Tom is not here. I had a chat with him when I was in London last week, and you know, I think without trying to put words in his mouth, it seems like he was more interested in getting the ideas out in that draft rather than proposing it as the natural starting point for the work. I guess, you know, just as a chair, my natural bias is to start with something small because there's less to dispute in something small. And so I have a little bit of a natural chair's bias towards the Open Future proposal. So what I'd suggest is we have a look at that and a talk about the Open Future proposal. If people want to advocate adopting the other proposal instead, we're certainly open to that. But let's come to an understanding of the room of where we want to start.
So Mark, I put together a vocabulary in my draft that's basically just polls.
Okay.
But it does have one more thing in it. I think we should probably talk about that.
Sure, and I fully anticipate that we're going to pull other things from other drafts, whether they exist now or not, and consider putting them into the draft we adopt. And again, I want to remind people that this is, you know, it's a starting point. There's not consensus on all the contents. It's just we have to start somewhere. And if we can identify that relatively easily, that enables us to get into the actual work and the actual discussions we need to have. So I don't want to over-rotate on what the starting point is. Miriam.
Can we have a quick look at?
It's okay, she's fine, go ahead.
Can we have a quick look at all the drafts as well to then figure out what the differences are? Because I guess we all read them at some point, but maybe not yesterday.
So the other thing of note related to that, so I'm also one of the contributors on Tom's document as well. It's derived from work on that happened at Paul's. It's basically also derived from Paul's work. So I believe that right now all of the proposals all fall back towards that proposal. So to your point, I think focusing on that as the starting point, since it's the starting point for the others, it seems like the right approach.
There's kind of a logical, we can consider pulling something out here and there, and then, you know, but start with the type core, as it were.
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, okay. Which one are you?
Open Future.
Every time I share a screen.
Sorry, draft dash
my machine crashes.
So that's not an accident, right? There's a lot of work that's gone into getting to that point.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So we.
It makes sense to ask Paul to give us the brief.
Yeah, we have a presentation from Paul.
You want to throw that out?
We'll look at the full list after we do that, maybe? Yeah. So go ahead and throw up Paul's presentation, and if you want to come up here and talk to the room, or we can do it from there, either way, whatever you're comfortable with.
Whatever works better. I don't think, just out of the picture for the, I think it's actually nicer for the remote participants too.
If you stay there. Yeah, fair enough.
Let me just preface this. This is sort of like presented as my proposal. There's a couple of contributors on the thing. It's obviously something that's part of a lot of discussions with a lot of people, but most of these discussions have taken place under Chatham House rules. So like I can't give appropriate credit to a lot of other people who have contributed to coming here. Like it's been an exchange of some of the other proposals. I'm waiting for the slides. Yeah.
slides don't show.
They're not showing up.
No.
What section will they, are they doing those for this session?
That is the right one.
But data tracker hasn't caught up yet.
But you screen share and do.
I think you have to screen share the slides, yeah.
That's what I'm trying to get. It's not allowing me to share the slides. You can share the slides.
No, the WebRTC issue, like,
You know better than me. Yeah. So I had this issue this morning.
Could I do
We fixed it all, but.
can you share the slides?
Uh,
Share your screen?
So they're not in,
They are.
They're in data tracker, but not in Meet Echo.
Okay. Although you can fix it, so
oh, no documents available. All right, give me a second.
that's it. Like, that's what I did.
Yeah.
It's not showing up, even though it's in the session.
I have.
It is in the right meeting, so I checked the location.
Oh, shoot.
You send the AI references to no display.
It's a different group.
Like, granted, screen sharing.
I really don't like screen sharing, but we'll make it work. We're going to get recursive for a second, so. Ooh, there we go.
Great.
Okay, thanks. So I need to give you indication. So
Yeah,
like, this is the yeah, let's just move ahead, like we're here. It relates to, like, I think it's pretty clear, should be pretty clear to everybody here that it relates to the first part of our 3 deliverables, where it says that the working group will deliver a standard track document covering a vocabulary for expressing AI-related preferences, independent of how these preferences are associated with the content. So it doesn't, like, that proposal, like, I think that also makes it different to your comment from the other proposals or the other drafts we have. So it really doesn't spend any time on talking about how these vocabulary terms are deployed in practice, how they are attached to protocols or other mechanisms. If you move to the next slide. It is important to note that this was developed in the EU regulatory context, so this discussion started that have led to this well before, like, I think this working group, or like we had the workshop in DC. And the context for this is that in the EU we have a sort of like double layer regulatory framework for this, which is on the first instance the copyright directive, which introduces 2 exceptions for text and data mining. And it's important to realize, I think Alyssa pointed to that earlier, that there's 2, one which is a broad, unrestricted text and data mining exception for the purposes of scientific research, which establishes a right to use any lawfully accessible work for the purpose of, like, to do TDM that has the purpose of scientific research. There's a couple of other smaller conditions here, but that is the gist on it. This is the one that's often forgotten in the discussions, because most of the discussions about preference signaling only apply to the second one, Article 4, which is an exception or limitation for text and data mining that establishes the right to do TDM on lawfully accessible works for any purpose, so for any purpose and by anyone, unless the rights have been explicitly reserved in a machine-readable way. What's important to realize is here that this machine-readable rights reservation in the EU is not present for the scientific research exception. So, like, even if you signal something in this context, you can still rely on the law and override it into a research, which I think gives us some ability to deal with this broad concept of TDM, which would be problematic in itself. It would come along. And then where this comes into, there's been long discussions about, like, is TDM the same as AI training or uses by AI? It's not fully resolved. Like, I think there is stakeholders who still have policy positions who say this was never intended to be this way, and maybe it doesn't cover everything. But there is at least a subsequent legislative intervention, the AI Act, which builds a very clear connection between the training of general purpose AI models and the idea of TDM. Article 51, it's 53(1)(c), there's a typo, requires GPA and model providers to put in place a policy to comply with union law on copyright and related rights, and in particular to identify TDM rights reservations. It actually points directly to that article. I've shortened that here to fit on the slide. But that's the context where we started these discussions and where this vocabulary has been developed, and it's important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. This has led us this has led us to publish about a month ago this proposal for vocabulary for opting out of AI training and other forms of TDM. Actually, this slide is, can you jump over the slide? This is the mistake, I think. Yeah, this is the further version. So we've published this vocabulary as part of a policy brief. There's about 10-page document that goes through like a bit of the context, like elaborates on the discussions that have happened in that context. That policy brief includes an annex, which is the proposal for an opt-out vocabulary, and that annex, the text of that proposal has been reformatted as that draft that is for discussion here. Like there's very small editorial changes. Like I think the first section was called purpose, and it's now called introduction, but for the rest, it's identical. If you go to the next slide, the purpose of this document, of this vocabulary, is to provide a common vocabulary that can be used for machine-readable opt-outs by parties who wish to restrict the use of their assets for the purpose of AI training and other forms of text and data mining. And the elements of the vocabulary can be used to describe in a standardized way the types of uses that a declaring party may wish to restrict or allow, thereby ensuring that opt-outs can be communicated, processed, and stored in a consistent and interoperable way. Here, obviously, this talks about opt-outs and restrictions. Like, I think this comes from the fact that this has been developed in the EU context. It actually goes on and goes to acknowledge that it's independent of the legal thing. And in the end, like we have designed it, or we think we have designed it in a way that things can be targeted to the terms defined in the vocabulary, either there can be a target of either an opt-out or an opt-in. I'll come back to that for a second. But like the purpose is really like that it wants to also enable, like one driver for this was enable interoperability between different mechanisms for making these rights reservations or other types of preference signals. That sort of opting out of X means the same within all the different mechanisms that you might apply to opt out of things. That's the function of vocabulary. Next slide, please. Design considerations. The first one I've touched on this, but like this is based on discussions in the EU policy legal context, so it's biased. You saw that in that language towards opt-out, but it clearly intends to be applicable in any legal context. The use cases categories, which are at the core of the vocabulary, are intended to serve as targets for expressing preferences that can be formulated as either opt-in or opt-outs. This has also informed the use of TDM as the umbrella category, which is based on the EU definition. Like we have to deal with there's a positive right to sort of reserve the rights that are covered by the TDM exception in the EU context. And so we need to if we want to make the vocabulary workable in the EU context, we need something in the vocabulary that allows people to exercise that right that they have in the EU context. Which explains why this category is in there that may not always be like a useful category in other legal regimes, because it maybe doesn't really like fit on aspects of that. The vocabulary is intended to apply the use of assets. Right? It is not intended to address the act of crawling itself. The main reason for this, I think a number of people touched on this, crawling is independent from the ultimate use cases. Many crawlers crawl for multiple use cases in the end. Like some of them, sort of like you will not be able to differentiate at the point of crawling between these different uses. So if we're concerned about AI uses, like we really need to target the moment where the training takes place or inference uses at a later stage.
Right, but obviously if the crawler is crawling content and it knows what those uses are, it can make decisions based on this information.
Yes.
At that time.
Next slide. Main sticking points in the discussions. So one of we've heard that here before, and it's also coming back as one of probably the open issues at the end. But the main discussion point was the relation between sort of like the use cases that we're trying to target and the use case that was commonly referred to as either search or search and discovery. In most of the discussions that have informed this vocabulary, we felt that this was important, but it was also out of scope for those discussions to come to a definition of a concept of search or search and discovery, because that we felt like basically the composition of the groups in which we discussed this weren't necessarily made them a suitable place for having this discussion. So without defining this as a use case category, which was out of scope, this cannot be completely resolved. The vocabulary sort of like sidesteps around that a little bit in sort of taking this approach that saying it's not intended to govern search and discovery, and points to the robust exclusion protocol as one example for the purpose of governing search type reasons. That is something that in the end, like I think in a similar way, rough consensus, like most participants in this discussions, like thought, okay, this is something we can all at least not disagree. And then the second part that was also like a big sticking point is a lot of this comes in relationship, like a lot of this discussion emerges in relation to the emergence of this category of generative AI, right? Like that is where many of the rights holders, many of the content producers, many of the content distributors started to perceive this technology, which is much broader, as something that is a challenge to their business models, or sometimes challenge to their ideas, how their content should be used responsibly or ethically. That is sort of like the inflection point for this thing. But generative AI is sort of relatively hard to define in a way. Like I think it's not necessarily like a sort of like a strong technical definition for this. And in our discussions, basically two approaches emerged to defining the idea of like how to differentiate generative AI from other forms of AI. One is based on the capacity to generate synthetic content, and the other one is on the purpose to generate synthetic content.
Just a comment from Alyssa on the chat, right? Like,
Yeah.
so she wanted you to clarify who are the people who participate in the discussions. You mentioned what kind of constituencies are there, if you can talk about it.
It is broad, like, so they were people like, so Chatham House rule can't mention anything. Like, I think we had broad representation from all sides of the debate that included sort of organizations that specialize in developing opt-out standards or facilitate the exchange of information in this space. We had companies that develop AI models, and we had different types of rights holders represented in these discussions, plus a number of sort of things I would qualify as sort of more generally public interest technologies. So I don't think it's very dissimilar from the type of organizations that are represented in this. Okay, let me not look at the chat because that's so I was at the point of saying that, so there's a mix of, or sort of like there's two approaches. The capacity thing runs into the problem, and that is something that was flagged mainly from the side of organizations developing AI models, that essentially most things that are developed under the current paradigm of AI development have some capacity of generating synthetic content. Like an example that was often given, image classifiers, which are seen as things that do not have the purpose to generate everything, but they are, I am told, very often, most often, like almost always, also have the capacity to generate synthetic content if you really want that to happen. So like a model that is, if you use a capacity-based approach, like basically a lot of things look like generative AI as a consequence. So that was something where sort of the side of people developing AI models were like, this is not a good approach for defining this. On the other hand, if you take a purpose-based approach, image classifier that may be capable of generating like synthetic content doesn't have the purpose when it's developed to do that. So if you take a purpose-based approach, that seems like an ability to go narrower, but there is a bit of a lack of trust within the ecosystem. Many organizations or people representing rights holders said like, yeah, why should we sort of at some point like make a sort of like base our decisions if we want to give permission to do something or withhold permission on what other entities say about a purpose at a given point in time. Like there's basically no trust towards the AI developers from large parts of the rights holder spectrum to say like, we'll trust you on that you will only use that for a specific purpose, especially since we know that the technology can be used much more widely. So in the end, we ended up on a mix between capacity-based and purpose-based. So the vocabulary itself, like a lot of talk, is super, super simple. There's 3 defined categories in there. The first one is text and data mining, which we did not have to define because it's defined in the EU Copyright Directive. So what you see there, the act of using one or more assets, everything after that, in the context of any automated analytical technique aimed at analyzing text and data in digital form in order to generate information we include, but it's not limited to patterns, trends, and correlations. It's actually the definition of text and data mining from the EU Copyright Directive. So that's, in our perception, the broadest category. Like you will note, like if you look at that sort of, to anybody who works with computers, this will look dangerous. Like it's basically like a computer does something with the work. So that's one. The second that we've defined is AI training. That's a very simple definition, the act of training AI models. And then generative AI training, which is this mix between capacity and purpose built. So the act of training general purpose AI models that have the capacity to generate text, images, or other forms of synthetic content, or the act of training other types of AI models, so not general purpose models, that have the purpose of generating text and images and other forms of synthetic content. This is the best approximation that we could make. Like this is sort of, it applies like the capacity to everything that qualifies as a general purpose, so that doesn't have a defined purpose, and it applies the purpose to everything outside of that, assuming that outside of general purpose models are single purpose models where you can then make a determination based on the purpose of the model. This is probably not perfect, but it's sort of like the best approximation that we could arrive at.
So, Paul, like for the, do you have any concept of this for the RAGs? Like I don't see anything covered in here. Like, no, is this something that?
No, I come back to that at the end of the thing. Like we're almost there. Like if you go to next slide.
Quick clarification, so is generative AI training a subset of AI?
Yes,
If I don't allow it.
It's all the,
Sorry.
yeah, all the subsets done.
So this slide answers almost both of the previous questions. So first of all, text and data mining is the overarching category. AI training is understood to be a subset of text and data mining, and generative AI training is a subset of AI training. So, and then the other thing, what you see there is like the vocabulary doesn't define a term, but it acknowledges in the vocabulary that there's probably a need for additional categories or use cases. And the one it singles out here is, we call it inference, but that's the inference rack type things, which is clearly missing from that. The reason for why it's missing is, I think, a bit threefold. First of all, again, we're doing this in the context. You can go to the next slide. I think I've written that down there. No, like go one slide further. So the reason that there's currently no use case that apply to cross-training users, call that RAG or inference or use of assets by already trained models, right? Like this type of users, is partially due to the fact that the concerns aroused fairly late in the process. Like when we started this work, this was really about people were much more concerned about only the training of AI models. It's a bit like an effect of timing when we started this work. Secondly, because the EU legal framework is less clear about such users. So like the connection the AI Act makes with the training of GPAI models, it doesn't make the connection between text and data mining with the deployment of AI models. That's actually not covered in the Act. And the third, I think, is also like a significant hurdle, and I've expressed that on the mailing list. There's also much less conceptual clarity in discussions around that. Like training AI models is something that I think everybody sort of like has a fairly similar understanding of that. I think that's sort of like well understood concept, versus like this field of what models do with copyrighted content in the deployment phase, call that RAG, or call that AI search, or call that inference use, or call that, I don't know, there's probably other terms for that, is still conceptually like a little bit more fuzzy, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to develop like a vocabulary term against it. But I think like I would agree that's absolutely necessary if we want to solve some of the issues that especially publishers have around the use of their content in this context. So this is one of the known shortcomings, and then the other known shortcoming at that moment is that we've sort of, in the end, our solution to the search and discovery question was a little bit sidestepping that issue by saying like, this is not intended to be used in this context, and sort of pointing to the robots exclusion protocol. I'm not entirely sure, like this is the best possible outcome for this process. Like I'm not necessarily sure that this is like a really robust approach to that. There may be other fora where that are better positioned to do that. One last thing, if you go back to the previous slide, and then that's my last slide, is again, like I think I said this morning, like this idea of a vocabulary is that the vocabulary is completely agnostic to the technical implementation of opt-out systems. And is designed, the main design purpose is to ensure that opt-out information can be effectively exchanged between different systems, right? Like that if some future version of the robots exclusion protocol includes some way of saying no generative AI training, that generative AI training is understood in the same way, that it means the same way as if, not to single anyone out, but Leonard, if like the CP2A contains a value, no generative AI training, that those two can be both linked to the vocabulary and therefore they match. So from the perspective of a user of data, so organization training models, like they can basically put that data into the same bucket because like they, well, in this case, they cannot train generative AI models with it, but maybe other types of AI. And there's like, this is a list of sort of like protocols that are around that we've been sort of us exchanging views with to various degrees. Some of them are like, some people involved with some of them have been contributed to this, some haven't, but like that is where we see like the level of intervention of the vocabulary initially. And then it probably goes down to sort of the type of work we will have to do here tomorrow and the day after, and then later for each of these things. How do you implement this terminology, this vocabulary in a specific context, be that robots exclusion protocol or IPCP plus or something else? I think that's it for now. Like there's a thank you slide. Yes.
The queue is Glenn, Mark, and then Brad.
So I had a question for you. Just go back to the beautiful little box with all of
the Venn diagram.
That's it. One of the questions that I came up against was AI sort of synthetically generate training data. So where I mine stuff and then I generate synthetic training data based upon the mining. Did you consider that in these discussions? Did you guys come to a proposal or recommendation on how to include it, or is it because you would not?
I would include that. If you take something, then you train a model on that so that you can train another model. That's.
I think it is like it fits in here from my perspective on two ends. Right? Like somebody produced this training data, and then the question is. Sort of like the act of producing such training data falls into the generative AI definition, right? Like because it produces synthetic, like the output of generative AI training is something, right? It's something that produces synthetic content.
So if you treat it like an entire system, content goes in, and the only thing that's coming out the other end is an AI model, and it may not be a generative AI model. So why would you include generative?
Well, but you're still generating something. An AI model.
Internals.
I think I get your point. Like I think at this point you're probably not operating in it, like you're operating probably in a closed situation. Like you're not like this. Yeah. This all of this isn't necessary if the entity who has the rights in the training data and the entity who does the training are the same entity. Like there's no you don't need to signal your own permissions to yourself, right? Like, and that is.
But one of the considerations, so.
We do have a queue.
This is part of my question.
You want to get in? No, yeah.
So part of the idea was that in the vocabulary for expressing the preferences, could there be a mechanism where you could say, essentially derivative work, so generated synthetic data built upon this would carry over the following set of policies. We'd like to express a policy that would be carried with the derivative generated synthetic data. Does that make sense?
I don't think you can say the output of what is a derivative work.
And that's why I'm trying to get away from the phrase derivative work, but it is conceptually like derivative work in that it's trained against one thing, set of things, and then tasked with creating synthetic training data as a result of that. And the reason this has come up is we're seeing this as a proposed approach to bypassing things like AI preferences. If you know, I've trained against you, but I'm not you. I'm generating synthetic data to bypass. So one of the proposals that we were kicking around in discussions was, could you have a mechanism included in the preferences to express your intended preferences for synthetically generated data from your training source?
So I'm
clarifying question?
Yeah,
Can I
yeah,
just
so
answer to that real quick?
You want me
Like,
to-
I think it's going already, again, one level below what we want the vocabulary to do, like, which sort of, like, the vocabulary in itself doesn't express policies yet. It doesn't express preferences. It provides the ideas, it provides categories, use cases, we use that interchangeably, those two terms, against that you can use as targets when defining these policies, right? Like, you can say, I want TDM to happen, I don't want TDM to happen. Like, obviously, you could, like, if you say, like, okay, this is not available, if you often been referred to as the big hammer TDM, like, if you say, like, no TDM with this whatsoever, you probably at least indicated that that scenario that you described, that's like that you're expressing the preference against that kind of scenario. So the question is then, like, we need to look at these as building blocks for policies, not as policies yet. We're not proposing specific policies, and this thing was saying, like, these are the building blocks, the targets.
Sure, but you have to understand the types of policy you might want to express with your building blocks in order to know if your building blocks satisfy these policy expressions. Does that make sense? Or does that sound too strict?
Go for the
So just one other thing that I'm going to clarify. As someone who was involved in the discussions that Paul is referring to, the other thing that came up during those discussions that's relevant to this and to other things is that what we also talked about, there's training the model, and then there's actually deploying and using the model. And so, and without meaning to complicate matters more, you're starting to get towards that second aspect, which is how is that model used? So you're talking about that model being used to produce synthetic data. That's now a use of the model, and that gets us closer to, at least in the discussions that Paul's referring to. Those were where we thought about inference and RAG and that side, because it's not training. And so it's this very interesting, it creates this very interesting scenario of how much do we slice the onion from thinking about, first we have gathering versus usage of the information itself. Then there's you train the model, you use the model, you deploy the model. Who's responsible for evaluating and respecting these preferences? And which are all great questions, and I'm not saying that there are answers, but these are all things that I think we need to keep in mind. So just Paul doesn't mind my.
And like, I've had a little moment longer to think about it. If I understand you correctly, the scenario that you are trying to describe is, and I think it's a hypothetical scenario where someone would want to allow the use of certain assets to train a generative AI model, but would want to object to the use of the output of the trained model as input for training for other AI, right?
That could, yes. Come back to the original source, don't.
I think at the moment, like, if this goes back to, like, also us being, like, interested in something that is relatively granular and simple, like, I think the answer in this scenario is, like, and I think it's like, is then you, like any of the categories that you have, if you say, if you use that as a target for an opt-out, you're also opting out of this. But like that very specific scenario, opting, like I'm fine with my stuff being used to train an AI model, but not an AI model whose output is used to train another AI model is not a scenario that we have addressed.
It's very similar to the practices around derivative works, where I will grant you the access to this work, but I do not grant you rights to create derivative works from this work. And those are put in place in the copyright regime so that I can grant you access to a work, you can make use of it, you can do whatever you want, but I specifically limit you, I prevent you from creating derivative works. In this synthetic training model, it's effectively an AI-generated derivative work, which itself may not have a right associated with it, right? Because it's generated value created, not human created. So it's not a derivative work in terms of copyright sense, but in terms of the business aspects or the other workflows, it is a workflow. And I'll argue that it is a relevant question to deal with, because from a rights holder perspective, it is not something that can be dealt with. And what you might find is many rights holders would simply default to no training at all, and it would pull back a lot of content that potentially could be included in training.
I think it depends on what you mean by derivative work, because if it were a derivative work that's coming out, then it would be protectable by copyright anyway, and you could, there's an actionable.
But because generative AI is not protected by copyright, because AIs cannot produce, a pure AI cannot produce a copyrighted work.
I mean, I think
So therefore, the act of
The discussion is starting to get
I
circular.
apologize. But I do think it's a relevant question ultimately for us to address.
I just one last thing, like I
Please.
don't think, I also think that runs into some kind of level of practicality things and how far it is realistic that somebody who puts a work or has a publication online to actually be in a position to express a preference signal and then sort of follow that through an AI model, which will then be used by a third entity to train that. Like I think the scenario everybody's thinking about is now sort of DeepSeek trained on OpenAI models, right? Like, and then somehow sort of like the copyrighted works will wash through that chain. I don't think at that stage, like you will be able to sort of solve these types of concerns by expressing preference signals on the open web. But I think that is to some degree, like probably a limitation to some degree of a preference signaling approach, which is not like a fully looked down contractual arrangements chain. But yes, like that is, I think like to your question, like that is not a specific scenario that we have considered, and that is not a specific scenario that's currently addressed in this vocabulary, but like the vocabulary acknowledges that it also does address all the concerns that might need to be addressed.
And so I'll respond to that by kind of popping up a level. And I think that what we need to do when we're looking at the vocabulary is to examine the terms and the definitions very carefully and throw arrows at them like this to make sure we understand how they're going to affect the real world. But how we respond to that is an interesting question. Early in my career, I was involved in something called the Platform for Privacy Preferences, which in many ways was quite similar to this. And we designed, yes, I know I'm guilty, I'm so sorry. I don't tell many people that. We designed something incredibly complicated that tried to anticipate every possible situation and combination, and it was absolutely useless. Whereas, and Carl presented about this at the workshop, the current trend is to define much simpler, carefully crafted vocabularies that are much closer to binary, so that there are fewer choices, and it's much more realistic to apply those to the real world. So I think it's good to have these discussions, but let's think carefully about how they affect the outcomes and what we actually should.
I agree, and I appreciate that, Mark. I will say that there's probably a few cases which we will ultimately have to deal with, just because in the end of the day, as these AI preferences are deployed, we want a thing which produces a useful expression and creates an enablement environment versus an environment where people say, well, I can't do these important use cases, so I'm going to default everything that you just know. And that would be a bad outcome. We can generate a great vocabulary, but if everybody just uses it to say no, I would say that's bad.
Okay. And moving on then, and I think
little
we,
thing which is,
well, if it's a little thing, because last time you said it was a little thing.
it's a little thing. The vocabulary also thinks that implementers of that vocabulary are free to have additional terms like that are not part of the vocabulary, as long as they don't operate hierarchically on the other terms, which means like that specific implementations can be more detailed.
When you say implementation, you mean consumer, like they would be defining the semantics there.
Implementation, I mean something like if CP2A would decide like, okay, we built our sort of.
Oh, I see. So an embedding.
Our
Okay.
sort of like preference signals we align them with the vocabulary. It would, in this case, mean like they would align them with these three categories, but they might have a fourth and a fifth, which are not part of the vocabulary. The idea is that the sort of aligned ones are then aligned across different.
Okay. All right. So regarding your illustration here, as I read your proposal, I like the smiley face. There's kind of an implicit carve out here for search and discovery, where it's outside of all of these boxes. Correct? That's how it works.
Yes.
Okay, great. And could you forward? Sorry, could you forward a slide or two slides? I think. So for the RAG use cases or inference time, one of the arguments here is that it wasn't clear in the EU legal process. I don't think that stops us from considering it. It may be that the poor semantics around it or the moving target may, but just, yeah. And search and discovery are agreed. Okay, so yeah.
And I agree, like I think it should, like that, for me personally, that's where it's most unfinished, like, because obviously that is a very real, very timely, and also very, for many business model critical concern, sort of, let's call them RAG type users, right? Like, and that ought to be addressed. We had longer discussions about that. There's additional things that as long as it's about training AI models, like the types of entities, it's clear what types of entities we're expressing the signal towards. This becomes also a little bit more fuzzy in the context of like RAG type users. Who is actually the entity that makes the use? Is that the person who prompts, like who enters this AI search query, or is that the entity deploying the model and executing the search query? Also keep in mind that we have like self-hosted models. Like we could also do this where like this is completely coming from an individual user where there's no sort of like model developer in that place. So like as long as we're talking about training, we have this sort of like fictitious audience of model developers, which is there's a lot of entities out there, but like it's relatively concise compared to when we're going into sort of where models fetch on behalf of users. It becomes more difficult to navigate there.
So then one of the big decision points maybe we should talk about soon is, are we going to try and attempt that in the first chunk of work or put it off to a subsequent chunk of work?
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I think we should attempt that in this first tranche of work. I think that those for search and RAG in particular publishers are the two biggest interests and issues, and therefore, you know, are probably the most important things that we would like to focus on in an exercise like this. I think that the work done in this paper is super helpful. I think it's probably a bit too focused on solving for the text and data mining exception, and perhaps gives a little bit too much deference to things like the definition of text and data mining as envisaged by a single jurisdiction. I think we, you know, back to our earlier discussion today, should make efforts to, you know, we should borrow from definitions that suit us, but not necessarily implement existing law that may be more specific to one jurisdiction compared to others. But it sounds like all of those possibilities remain open, at least to focus on search, to focus on RAG. It certainly seems to fall very squarely within the mandate of this working group, which doesn't only focus on training. It also talks about deployment. It also talks about use of AI models, of generative AI, and so I think that training would indeed be the lowest hanging fruit, but I don't think that we should stop there, and we shouldn't stop there for the purposes of this first step.
Thank you.
Thank you. There will be two different comments. The first of which is the dispatch question. Is this good enough for us to start from? Which is, I think, what the chair is looking at.
We're getting there. Yeah.
I think it is. So I will say there are things that need to change about this, but this is close enough to the right scope, and it's good enough for us to start working on. The second thing is, if I were to start tweaking, I think I'm with Brad that there are some pieces of this that are maybe a little bit too starting from a text and data mining perspective, and I think if we break this down, if we're talking about data acquisition, we're talking about analysis, and we're talking about actions. And I think we have a very good grasp that data acquisition is mostly request response protocols, although Gary has given me a scary example of wanting to do this with SMTP, which is causing me, I'm sure I will keep up at night to think about that. The analysis, we're talking about search and discovery, we're talking about generative AI, we're talking about non-generative AI, and more will come there, inference, recurrence. I think where we're going to want to be very, very careful is going all the way into action when we're still on vocabulary. And I've heard a lot of people want to talk about the actions when we're still talking about the vocabulary and the acquisition and the analysis. And I think being pretty concrete about those three different things is going to be useful. And I'll give an example. Imagine, for example, that we've had somebody go out and get a bunch of data, they've acquired it, they have created an analysis that gives you the lowest prices on various things. There are two different actions, one of which is they use it to guide their own behavior. That's never exposed to the public. It's merely how they're making their own purchasing decisions. And for a large enough organization, NATO just down the street, for example, that might be worth doing. Or they expose it to the public. From the point of view of conceptual analysis, those are the same, but the actions are different because the implication for the people who made the data available are different. But we have to be very clear about what's being permitted in each one of those and keep them separate. Because if we try and create a lump that says, you can do this lump, which this kind of data, this kind of analysis, and this set of actions, it's going to be a mess to work with. So I think this is a great place to start. We probably want to change the structure of our thinking a little bit to think about the pipeline in a slightly more architecturally broad way, but that we can get there from here. Thanks.
I dealt with that earlier, so thank you.
Sure. To pick up somewhat on the conversations going on over here earlier, and you imply here that a shortcoming of this is that it doesn't cover inference as a use case about which you might want to have vocabulary. I think if you take it as a given that whatever is then presented at the end of this process has to be useful, like you don't want people vocabulary on things that no one can ever actually act on, I'm not sure inference is a useful category. Partly because of there's no copy involved here. This isn't just about copyright, but once the inference is happening, it's happening. And also because I think it's very likely we'll get more and more like local compute things happening here. And there's no sense of you can control what individuals do on their laptops. So I think the place where you can give people autonomy over their data will be training the model weights, right, in some sense, and then search and display, RAG situations. And those two buckets are probably enough to cover most of the things that internet users want control over at this stage. But inference feels like an unhelpful thing to tell people they might be able to control, when in practice I don't see how you'd be able to enforce or influence that anyway.
My interpretation when people talk about inference time is techniques like RAG, where it's calling out, gathering new data, and using that to inform the model.
But then there was a discussion earlier of like, would they ever allow someone to train but not infer in the process of creating like synthetic data, which I think is this like Ragular's version. But fine, if that's really the difference.
Can I just give another example? So the other, if I can, the other common use case for inference is style reference. So we were talking earlier, and I gave the example of the Studio Ghibli situation that's going on. Should they be allowed to stipulate that assets that they've created cannot be used for someone to say, create something in the style of this other image? And this is a real world scenario, putting on my Adobe hat. Our customers are asking for this, which is one of the reasons this particular option exists in C2PA.
But they still want to allow it to be used for training.
They may. To them, those are two very different scenarios. They may allow it in one scenario, they may not in the other, or both on or both off.
Right.
That's often could also be controlled through prompting rather than controlling the training. So, for example, you could just block the use of Studio Ghibli in a meta prompt. If that makes sense. So if someone says create something in the style of X, you just block the name X.
There are two different things. So one is
an image.
Sorry, one at a time, please.
Sorry. So one is that would be true if I didn't have a reference. One is the use of a reference image or a reference asset. So I actually have an image in style X. I'm just using Ghibli as an example, and I feed that in as part of the inference. It's not part of a prompt. It's an additional piece of data fed into the model as part of the request. It's not, but what you're saying is a different thing. They're both relevant, but
yeah, I guess at the moment, if I want something in Studio Ghibli, I won't have to feed something in at a point of inference.
correct.
That is a Studio Ghibli.
Because it's something people.
I would just put the name in the prompt, and then we can.
So we do have a quite long queue.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
now. We have a long queue.
jump
It
out.
sounds like we have one more person on it. I'm going to ask, if you're on the queue, I'm sure you have something that you want to bring up, but if you could also at the same time answer the question that Ted brought up, which is this a good basis for the start of the work? Or if you think that that's a good idea or not. Who's next? Lydia.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the slide with the boxes. If you can move back. I'm not sure this is quite right. Maybe I don't understand TDM well enough, but my understanding of TDM was always that it's kind of data mining to the purpose of kind of building knowledge, I would say. You have a question, you want an answer, you want to like use a big amount of data to answer that question. And that was also what happened when like machine learning models started or whatever. But then if you actually then use the model to create content, that I'm not sure that is part of TDM even, so I'm not sure that box should be really inside there.
The definition is computers doing things with data. That's it. That is the definition.
And the box that is in there is specifically training. Sort of like it says generative AI. Training the model is a form of TDM. It doesn't say that using a trained model is a form of TDM. Because and training, sort of like I think most people will agree that it's some form of statistical analysis of patterns within large data sets fits pretty well on what's going on in.
But then, I mean, actually there's a difference because you said that the example about image processing, right? It's the same model that you use to detect an image and the same model that you use to generate an image, just the additions that we put on the model. But the model might be the same.
Yes, which is why sort of like the model might indeed be the same. It would probably be qualified here unless you build something, and so I'm not technical enough, but that you use some other than the currently prevailing types of approaches of building models to build like something which can classify images but cannot generate that. This is probably a relatively, this is misleading, probably like that is at the moment like the smallest, the AI training category, like it's with the current practice, maybe the smallest thing, probably a lot is generative AI training. A relatively small subset of users is AI training that's not considered generative under this. And then there's TDM around it, which is probably again a relatively broad spectrum of different forms of computational analysis that might have nothing to do with AI training.
And Miriam, any opinion on the dispatch question?
For me, it depends on this fundamental question, if we get this right, if it's kind of really one set of things, or if we're, like, I'm feeling generative AI is more something separate, orthogonal to it, and then that might not be right. So that's, okay.
But we could reorganize the draft if we
But
could.
then we can also adopt an empty draft, right?
We have to start somewhere. Alyssa.
So I.
Network
Oh.
problem.
I think your audio is very choppy.
Feel bad.
Can you type it into the chat?
Turn your video.
Try to switch my audio.
Okay. All right, we'll go back to Alyssa when she resolves that. Yari?
Yeah. So first, a good enough starting point, I think, for the vocabulary. So we could start from that. Two, I want to make an argument that the inference time is an important case for users, and it would be maybe a bad idea if we sort of bundled it together with the general training stuff. A lot of good things would be lost. One example is that you can use this RAG and inference time and other techniques. And RAG, by the way, is just like one particular technique. There'll be many other techniques as well. But you can use them to like answer questions that, take a look at these documents, is a particular thing in there, and things like that. And sort of the end user is able to do things, and it would be unfortunate if the end user would not be able to do stuff like that in the future. When the bigger problem is maybe with those who build the large-scale models. But I do think we have a couple of options here. So starting from this structure on the screen, we could agree, for instance, that training is just training, like proper model training, and we explicitly say that inference is not part of it. And then maybe we later define something, but we could just have the initial model, initial vocabulary, just have training that doesn't cover other stuff. We could define inference time as a separate category, but then we have to define that, and that is a little bit of a difficult task. Or we could go to a different vocabulary, like Alyssa was suggesting on the list earlier, where the sort of the mechanics of like what are you doing with your AI toys is not so relevant as is the effect it has on the publishers, like whether you're being linked back or not. Those are I think the essential choices that we have. I think I'd generally be fine with all of them. Maybe I'm sort of drawn a little bit into this, making it explicit that inference time is not covered by this. That's sort of outside the policy.
Yeah. Alyssa, you want to try again?
Yeah, is this better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, great. Sorry, it's a headphone problem. So I have two questions and a comment. So my first question is for Paul. Do you have a definition of AI model that you use for this?
Do you have a definition of the AI?
Yeah. Like I was thinking, like first question, if she was coming up with additional questions. We don't have a definition in the vocabulary. Like we use the term GPAI model in the sort of like in the definition of generative AI training, which maps to like a concept used in the AI Act. Again, this is to some degree, I fully agree to sort of like this, if this becomes like discussion piece here, like it needs to be less EU-centric, but keep in mind that this comes out of discussions that have been held in the EU context, which is why we sometimes use what in this area I would argue a shortcut to just rely on sort of AI Act terminology to define that. But that would need to be addressed.
Yeah, that feels like very necessary for this. So just noting that as an action item. My second question maybe is for, I don't know, Fabrice or someone else who's there, but I feel like it's possible that even with this simple vocabulary, it ends up capturing some search-related use cases, because my intuition is that some sites that get indexed into search indexes are then used to train predictive models to do things like predict which features of this page lead to certain click-through rates and that kind of thing for search. So I'm curious if people feel like even if you think we're not addressing search, we might, like through the back door, be addressing some search use cases by virtue of there being AI training broadly included in this vocabulary. Or I can just hold that out as a question and people can think about it. But I don't claim to be an expert, but it just came to my mind. My last point is just,
Yeah.
oh, you have an answer?
Alyssa, I think like Gary had something to say about it. Do you want to hear it or do you want to just continue?
Yeah. Sorry, I can't really see the room. It's like,
No, that's fine. Yeah,
so I added myself to the queue exactly because of what you said. Basically, AI training is way too broad for our liking. Because, for example, safe search or many of the ranking components are technically AI. They are some form of machine learning. It could be statistical ML or some other form of stuff. Gmail spam filters are largely machine learning models, which are AI. And basically marketing ruined the word AI for us, but yeah, I'm pretty sure that like AI training in that box is way too broad. That said, dispatch, great.
Alyssa, you can continue.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. And I think now that I think of it, actually, that same is true for like if we were applying these to social media content, like if if a user wanted to be able to declare some of these and then say like opt out of AI training, but like actually all a social media network is like a like the recommender system is just a giant pile of machine learning models. So would you be opting out of that or not is an interesting question. My last point is just like on the starting with something super simple and then imagining that you're going to add things later. I definitely agree, like we need points of extensibility, but I also just wonder like how many times do we expect content controllers, content owners, site owners to be updating their attachment or preference infrastructure and like making changes to this to accommodate like new items that are coming into the vocabulary later. It's my sense that there might not be too many bites at this apple. So I would prefer that the initial vocabulary capture like the core use cases that are causing people pain that we already know about, even if it involves having to describe some things in a vocabulary that we don't have words for, today on April 8th. But that's just my preference. I like this document, but I wanted to have a little bit. I wanted to address some of the known use cases that we already see today.
So I'm interpreting that as for the dispatch question, you're supportive of using this as a starting point?
I would like to see how we go on what these additional use cases are first.
Oh, yeah. So when I looked at this one, I sort of thought that the act of training the model is not really that interesting to people. It's really the use of the model ultimately that people care about. I mean, particularly when it comes to the generative AI scenario, if you're producing content, it doesn't matter that someone's generated an LLM that can go out and do things. It's when it's actually out there being used by people to create content that's in competition to you. And so that was my initial impression here, was that trying to capture the use was critical. And I think I've come around in the course of this discussion to realizing that maybe we just need both in all of this. And I do think that Gary's example of spam filters is going to be an interesting one. Maybe you don't get the chance to opt out of use within the spam filtering context. Maybe the preference is ignored, and that's necessary because of the nature of that particular system. That's always an option in this space, because I do think the general rules here are good. And having very broad buckets is a useful way of approaching the problem, because it means that you you more closely align with how people think about the use of their information. And even if it means that it has some potential collateral effect, I would prefer that we try to cleave more closely to how people conceive of these things than trying to avoid the potential for those problems to happen. So I think, to Alyssa's point, I think we really need to get further into the search question, and the inference question, I think, is pretty straightforward as far as I'm concerned. It has to be involved in this at some level. I lumped them together because I didn't know any better, but now I think a separate inference usage would be the way that I would go.
And the dispatch question.
Oh, I thought I already said that. This is the only conceivable base to start this work from at this point.
But it sounds like there's a lot still to talk about.
Right.
Piers, thanks for waiting. Go for it.
Hi, yeah. I'd like to sort of second points from Alicia and Mirja actually about the search, I think, is probably inevitably going to be largely kind of AI driven to one degree or another. I mean, depending on what you class as AI, because things are going to be put into some sort of tokenization system. That's the sort of first step of the AI training or for inference. So then, so it seems to me that search is going to kind of come under the AI bracket one way or another, virtually entirely. But it also, there are other things I just wanted to mention in that one, you sort of often with models, say for example Llama, it's trained on a whole bunch of content which was scraped, whatever it was, a year or two ago. Then the model's shipped, and then a lot of people do fine tuning of those models with other data. So that, or whatever, the RLHF, various other kind of, they retrain the model, but don't sort of completely retrain it. So that may or may not come under training. I guess it probably comes under training really because it's a single act, which doesn't happen very often. But then moving to the sort of inference side, where we have a RAG, I mean, we see that as quite an important part of the whole thing. I mean, RAG really, to me, I mean, I'm no expert on how it all works, but it's my sort of understanding of how it would typically work would be that they would have to create some kind of search index of all the relevant material that one user might like bring up in their in the sort of prompt. So for example, I mean, there are sort of simple examples of RAG implementations where you have like a vector database which is created from the tokenized sort of material that's been pulled in from the internet. So that in some ways you could call the inference side the sort of building the model context, and that of course ties into this sort of model context protocol, which ultimately just does pull in other stuff, whatever it, mostly it would seem to be the model context protocol things, just as brought up on the email list, would typically be from some kind of, let's say, private sources. So be it sort of IMAP or some other API. So that would be sort of authorized stuff. So in some senses, I'd see that as sort of slightly out of scope of this work, because the authorization aspect and so on puts it beyond that. But anyway, I just to sort of summarize, really, I think that the RAG is key, really, or the inference side, or just let's say the model context. I think, like with Mirja said, analysis generation and inference isn't a bad way of putting things. But I'm not quite sure whether we draw a distinction between generation and inference even, because the generation comes at the inference stage, which is essentially the inference is driven by the building of the model context for the model to then run the model with that context. I don't know if that's useful.
So Piers, to the dispatch question, do you support the adoption of the document?
I support it roughly, but I would like to see an inference. I think at the moment we're still not quite clear how to define it. At the moment we're calling it inference, model context, something like that. But I think that's a kind of crucial part that needs to be included, and not at a sort of second stage, because a lot of this stuff is the sort of relevant data is the stuff that's appearing kind of now, and that's really a lot of that stuff will be used to inference time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's just to clarify that use of data from RAG, that is a form of copying. Like I think we saw with Perplexity where they scrape websites posing as other search crawlers. They, in their terms and conditions, claimed that they were not scraping and copying sites, they were making a short factual summary of the content that was on the page, which meant they had to copy the page in order to create a short factual summary. So that was entirely copying, and it was competing directly with commercial products like the FT, because they give a full summary of kind of today's articles, a paid-for service with their revenue go back to the original source content. The other example is Meta. They create their own search index. They don't have a search engine. They have their own search index, which they refer to for RAG purposes. So I think it's important to nix the idea that RAG is copying IP or with personal data to broaden it out beyond RAG.
And any thoughts about whether you support the document as a starting point?
If we can find a way to include inference in it, that's enough.
But it's pretty clear that that's something that will be discussed. So
yeah, that's why we put that in there.
Paul, you are done.
Oh, so I had I initially wanted to respond to the whole inference question with examples when I raised my hand, but I have a couple of things that I just wanted to maybe respond to here. So like the other inference type use that I had in mind is, in addition to the style transfer that Leonard had, is like translation. You put in like a work into a sort of AI model and ask it for doing a translation. In many systems, that's considered to be a copyright relevant reproduction of the work. And so there is really like a relatively broad range of translation summarizations that you have, style transfer, all these kind of things that sort of lack a good, concise definition that everybody agrees what's inside that box and outside of the box. So like, I agree that needs to be addressed at some point. A couple of points about the EU centricity about this. Like obviously, like we need to change the reference points, the languages. I will also say, in order for this to work in the EU legal context, because to my knowledge, I think I'm pretty knowledgeable in this part, the EU legal context is the most specific one where actually a right to make a rights reservation to these type of uses exists. Like it needs to also fit into that thing, because otherwise it's simply not, there will be other ways of exercising this right which will not be interoperable with this vocabulary. And I guess we want to avoid that we have something that doesn't work in the EU because it's not EU specific enough. At this moment it is too EU specific, and it clearly like starts from that, but there is, for better or worse, we need to deal with this situation in the EU. To some degree, like some people I think pointed out that sort of like some of the terminology, like I think I in my presentation said rights holder a couple of times. What we actually, like the vocabulary document itself introduces the concept of declaring party, partially in order to make sure that this can be people who hold rights in this thing, that can also be publishers, like who control the context where something is published. So I don't know if declaring party is the best thing, but like we explicitly moved away from the idea of saying this is a sort of vocabulary that can only be exercised by rights holders. The sort of to the concerns raised by Alicia and then by Gary to some degree. Again, obviously, that is obviously like something that came up a lot in these discussions. I've been in rooms where there were many people like who are more on the rights holder side. People want to like there's also a large contingent of people who want to object to things in broad terms. To some degree, by offering them a set of like smaller, more precise terms, like you probably want to give them the opportunity to be as precise as possible in indicating what they want in order to avoid collateral damage. I think the natural reaction, if you don't understand this space very well, is go for the broadest possible thing. But a widely adopted thing where like the sort of very tailored generative AI training opt-out actually proves to be effective, probably would have hopefully the effect of people moving towards this more specific thing. So this is something where I think you need to give them a couple, or you need to give people a vocabulary of options, and then I think there is an educational aspect to this, to both sides. It comes from both sides. And the last point, I think that was on the screen appears, I think this sort of fine-tuning of existing models is probably considered to be at the training stage of things and not at the inference stage, at least in how we conceptualize this. And I won't speak to the dispatch question.
Yeah,
You're free to.
He's already made the decision.
I don't know.
All right, from Timid Robot. First, I think that the vocabulary needs to include search and to be a little bit like specific, like tying it to like indexing and reference. And I think one of the reasons that's important is, again, we keep thinking about this within the context of robots, and it's easier to dismiss including search if robots is like next to it. But this vocabulary is going to be used in other places where that is not necessarily an option. And then I think going back to the point of like being, or kind of also to Paul's point, I think adding that specificity will allow people to, will give people the tools to participate when they might not otherwise participate. The second thing is I think that there might be value in not differentiating between the interactions, like collection, training, inference, etc., especially at the beginning, and just saying that the vocabulary applies to any interaction and putting a duration, right? Like I think we naturally assume there is a duration. If someone reads the preferences, right? Like it's been seconds, nanoseconds, seconds, minutes, hours since they read those preferences, they're still considered good. And I think that we can actually define the duration before the preferences are stale. And so that, you know, if someone is using common crawl data from years ago, they might need to re-examine the preferences. Whereas if they, you know, they crawled it last week, there's not a need there. Thank you.
So to the question of adoption, is this, do you have any opinion?
I do. I think this is a good basis for adoption, and I think the keyword there is basis. I don't think that we need to hold up a yes or no based on whether we revise the document. That if we accept it, I assume there will be a lot of revision.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Mark, you're up next.
Oh, I'm up next. Okay. So I was wondering about the outer box, the text and data mining box, and I understand certainly that that's, you know, an obvious thing to include from the European context, but from the context of our charter, I don't know that it is relevant, and I wonder how often it will actually get used. I'm just curious what you would think if we removed that. Does that break anything?
Yes.
But I think it breaks, sort of somebody else will then come and, like, if you like, so there's two levels to this, like having it in the vocabulary and implementing it in a specific opt-out system. Like, I think there is, for example, I think it's fair to say, Leonard, that the TDM rep people have sort of, for example, built their conceptual framework around doing rights reservations from that thing. And I think for them, it will be very hard to implement the vocabulary if this is not part of it. On the other hand, like, I don't understand the vocabulary as something that necessarily requires every implementer to implement everything, to do a sort of, like, not to put you on the spot, Colin, but like spawning's initial do not train registry, right? Like, which set sort of binary train, not train flag against something that wasn't entirely specified what it actually was, but like, I think it is maybe the generative AI target. Maybe that is something where a system like spawning would only implement one of the use cases of this thing. I would say, like, we don't, like, this discussion about text and data mining is not particularly relevant for the sort of like type of like declaring parties that we are targeting here. But I think it breaks to some degree, and I think it also would probably break trust by part of at least the European rights holder community in this thing, because this implies it's derived from text and data mining. And that is a right that they have and that they value in the current context. And the other thing also, like, look at sort of what's going on in the UK at the moment, like, which is also departing from, like, trying to build a framework based on the umbrella term text and data mining. And I think you will need this as, in certain contexts, you will need this as an attachment token. In how far it will be used, like, my suspicion would be, this is like, everybody who talks about it at some point, like, refers to it as the big sledgehammer, right? Like, that is not precise, probably not very useful unless you have a, let's wait and see, let's see how this plays out, and like, I'll cover all my bases for now. That's what it's useful for. I would think if this emerges that you can actually sort of work in a well-defined way with the more targeted categories, like that over time, the use of this sledgehammer category sort of diminishes. But that's speculation also on my part. Like,
sure. And listening to that discussion reminds me that, one of the things we probably need to talk about is, how abstract this framework is. You're talking about how it's applicable in all these different possible, expressions. And that kind of cuts both ways. It's very, broad. At the same time, if I'm, someone with content, how do I know that what I express is going to be respected, because there are so many different ways to express it. And that's probably worth a discussion at some point.
There is, like I mentioned during the presentation, this thing about the buckets, like that cuts both ways, right? Like, there's also, like, I think the more different categories you have for rights holders to express preference signals against, the more the cognitive overload, right? Like, not like there will be big big entities who are very sort of good at navigating complex systems, but like, I think you also want to have some consolidation of the terminology in order to make it easy for people to express themselves.
There's that dimension, and I agree with that from my experience. But there are potentially now so many attachment mechanisms that are quite diverse and often overlapping, and it's not clear how that's going to sort out. And then the other aspect is the level of abstraction in the draft is quite high, and there's a discussion which Martin started to go into what's the interface between the vocabulary and the different attachment mechanisms. Is it abstracted at a high level and they have to map out the syntax, or do we define something syntactual and it's just a string that you put in different places? And again, that's a discussion to have.
Sort of maybe one last disclaimer. Like, also, this is for us, for me, like for I think many people involved in this discussion the first time, that they are also ending up in for like this, where like you're trying to build sort of attachment mechanisms between sort of abstract policy goals and technical implementations on protocol level, right? Like to some degree, the honest answer is also good question. Like I don't know.
I don't know the answer.
Right?
Yeah.
But you're right. Like we will need to figure that out.
Okay.
Okay. Sonia, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, I had a similar concern around text and data mining and how broad it is, but I appreciate the comment to wanting to keep it in and how it is relatively straightforward. I wonder if it could essentially snap around the accepted specific use cases that we are opting out of. So generative AI training being one, and expand to the extent that there are other specific use cases that are added that people have concerns with, because it's going to be very hard to implement if people just opt out of text and data mining. I think not knowing what the implications are. For example, accessibility tools won't work. They won't be in search. There's going to be a huge amount of number of scenarios I don't think we've considered, and I don't think that, particularly if we're looking at an MVP by August, trying to define text and data mining broadly, or even AI training, is going to be tricky. So if we could start with the specific area of concern and allow for an expandable text and data mining exception that expands around the specific scenarios that we will add, so that it doesn't feel like it's too limiting. Maybe that's an approach.
And any thoughts about using this as the start for our work?
Yeah, I think it could work, provided that the vocabulary is
Lots of discussion.
yes.
Yeah.
Brad.
Yeah. So along those lines, I was thinking that perhaps the broader text and data mining bucket actually moved to a second tier, where we consider the work that's being done elsewhere and how these more specific categories could interoperate with that. Given that work has already been done on text and data mining opt-outs, I'm not suggesting that we discard it. It just does feel like when you give those that are risk averse the broadest category, they'll use the broadest category. And if the object is to ensure that people have more granular options so that they can exercise them and not put up barriers, then I think we should focus on defining the best use cases for the specific options that will be of most use to people as opposed to others. Now, to recognize how important text and data mining is, given the EU framework, given it's sort of entering the nomenclature of frameworks beyond the EU, and that's how people think about these sorts of things as an opt-out, and almost use the concept of TDM interchangeably. I think that can work against this process as well, where people will simply see there is one big on-switch, off-switch that you can use and take care of all of it, and that'll be the end of the conversation. And that will, I think, eviscerate much of the effort that we put into defining these more specific categories. So it's a suggestion to consider. The same, I think, applies to the question of AI training. I think the loudest and most articulate use case has been made in the context of generative AI, and I think, as we've also heard, there are areas beyond that in the context of inference and questions around search that are still in the mix. I haven't heard, or at least I'm not sure, maybe others in the room or maybe others in the list can point this out, what specifically about the use of content for AI training as apart from search, as apart from inference and RAG, as apart from generative AI, are people concerned about? Is the community concerned about? Do we need to solve for a problem that doesn't exist, is my question, and it really is a question. I don't want to cast doubt on that, I just don't know.
And any thoughts about adopting the draft?
With all those caveats, I think this vocab slide is a good place to start. I think broader document goes into a lot of other things, as you mentioned, but, you know, certainly using this as a basis for discussion is useful. Yeah.
John? Hi, thank you. Firstly, +1 to adoption. I think this is a great starting point. There's lots of things going on. I'm not sure that putting in vocabulary for particular uses like style transfer was discussed somewhere in the room is going to be practical, simply because if you have open models, then models are going to get passed around using different things. Developer who, you know, in good faith puts together a model for one purpose, promising no Ghibli-bot, might reasonably find for no fault their own it's used for a different purpose. I think it's worth promising to users that you can like have that respected in a reasonable way. But particular technologies are more likely, so, or particular technologies are more practical. So no to Gen AI, no to RAG, but maybe yes to certain kinds of other emphasis. I think that there are lots of other use cases for things like RAG and like general inference time uses of agents, I would rather say. I had a really good case the other day from someone who pointed out that if you're in an online shopping marketplace, agents really mess everything up for you because suddenly like you've got bots with like 1,000 things in their cart and you can't do any testing. There are lots of other use cases that people will care about who want to control what kind of AI interactions happen on their sites. So I think just talking ahead should be aware of that. The last one is that I'm very in favor of having text and data mining as a category for a number of reasons. One is that, like we came up before, that there's not a great definition of AI. AI as a word is relatively recent, like in mass adoption. We had like the late 10s, it was always deep learning, and then suddenly it became AI just because it was bigger. Whilst we're still uncertain about this, TDM is useful. There's also loads of like really simple things you can do that definitely don't involve what anyone would describe as like a neural net. You know, looking for offensive vocabulary on a social media post, for example, like probably text and data mining, probably not AI. Probably want to make sure that good faith actors can say, if you say no to TDM, I'm actually not going to respect that because I want to be able to check your content, but it has no offensive language. So I think having the TDM as a bucket there is actually useful. There is an awful lot of stuff that involves TDM that we might want to essentially force on users in some cases, and that's probably okay. Yeah, that was everything. Thank you. Pass on to the question.
I'm tempted to close the queue unless you haven't given an opinion about adoption. That's a little bit Mark.
So Paul raised the point about how concrete this draft is, and I think that's another thing that I think needs to be fixed. In the draft that I put up, so I said, here's how you encode that as a string, and here's how you take that string and interpret that string. I think that's kind of critical to have. I don't know if it belongs in this draft or another draft or whatever it is, but I think that's a critical component, because if we're talking about the same vocabulary getting used in multiple contexts, then having different ways to express it is, I think we'd be doing everyone a disservice. If you want to just respond briefly.
Yeah, I just want to respond to that. So like, it comes back to a point, like we're discussing this as a draft, as a starting point for discussion. That thing is also a sort of like closing point of another discussion, right? Like, and I think that a lot of this is sort of, I've been torn between feeling that I also need to defend the outcomes in that thing, because it's sort of like a rough consensus document. So if we can only look at going forward, like, yes, like with a different, like based on our charter, with a different group of people, obviously some considerations will be different that comes to like the terminology used, the things. Like, I think it is important to some degree, not necessarily reopen all of the definitional things, because at that point, like the connection gets completely lost. But like this sort of like how it goes, this was never written with the intent of becoming an internet graph. It happened to be. And thanks for your help with that.
Well, we'll see what we can do to make those better. A few things came up during this discussion. If we're going to be saying something about inference, I think it's incumbent upon us to understand the limitations of what that's going to entail. So Leonard gave the example of, I'm uploading an image as part of the context of the query that I make of a generative AI system. And I say, make me an image based on this one in some way, or in the style of this one, or what have you. I cannot imagine, under any circumstances, that model or the person operating that system refusing to use that image, no matter what it says on the image. Now, I may be wrong. There may be
I can
circumstances.
tell you there are systems that do that today.
Right? But they may, so you may be building systems that do that today, but as someone that ships client software, the software does what the user tells it to do. And at some level, there may be software out there that looks at it and says, this thing's tagged, and it says you can't do inference with it. Too bad, I'm ignoring that. Right? And that is a likely outcome of some of these things. So we need to keep that in mind when we talk about
preferences.
Preferences for inference.
It's not ERM, it's preference.
Right, it's a preference, right? The other thing is it's different when you think about something like RAG, where there's just content sitting on the web, and you don't have any direct instruction to use it. The thing that bothers me about having inference as a separate bucket at this top level, and by the way, I think TDM needs to be here. I don't think we can get away with it. I think we might need to massage the definition, but having it as a separate bucket, I think a lot of people will be kind of okay with that. But then I have to ask the question: how do you connect the sub-level generative AI training with inference for generative purposes? Because I think a lot of where this comes from is people are concerned about the use of content for generating content like it. And this exact example of the image that's being uploaded for the purposes of generating one like it is exactly the sort of thing that artists and content creators are most concerned about. And if we only provide them with inference, yes or no, without inference for generative purposes, yes or no, I think we may be failing in that regard. So add Paul to the list because I think that one requires a response.
Fabrice?
So first, to answer Matt's upcoming question, yes, I think this is a very good start. We all want a limited vocabulary, clear vocabulary. Second is, I do not believe we should have an extension. I heard about extension for search. I don't think this is needed. What we should have is what does this mean for search? All these kind of words on the screen. And this need to be really coming from publisher because this is the one that are tagging, they own the content, they tag it. And so what does it mean for them? For instance, the text and data mining we have here, what does it mean to set no text and data mining for search? Again, today I believe that we have option for them to satisfy no text and data mining. This is called disallow and this is no index. Somehow this is triggering no text and data mining. So again, I am expecting to have kind of an explanation, definition, what does it mean for search in the scenario of search, and we may have for other scenarios.
So just to clarify, I think that's already in the draft. It may need to be more explicit.
Yes, more explicit. Yes, for search, for AI, what does it mean?
Yeah, so I'm okay with using the document as a starting point, but I have said in chat that it is, it is very Eurocentric, and we have to kind of move it away from a single jurisdiction because our protocols, I believe, should be jurisdiction agnostic. So if we are going to keep certain elements, it should not be because TDM was something that was discussed in the European jurisdiction or any other jurisdiction, or in Singapore or Australia. It should be because that as a global standard, we need that to be in the standard and the protocol. So it should be more about what the technical needs for signaling AI preferences now than what certain jurisdictions want. Because otherwise, down the road, you're going to have regulators who come and expect us to standardize based on their preferences. And also another thing that, Leonard, I know that we are not doing GRM here, but signaling preferences and could create liability, and not aligning with those preferences could create legal liability for the end user in court. So it's not that, it's not without legal responsibility.
For the user or for the implementer?
For, it depends on the case that we're talking about. But I know that this is all non-binding, but we have to also consider that it can be essentially used in court.
So, Brooke, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
I think I heard your answer to him, but let me use his, for the, when you say the user here, do you mean the person who's making the declaration of preference? Mm-hmm. So when you were talking about the user who get into trouble.
In the Martin's case.
No, instead of talking about rights holders, he moved to talking about the person making the declaration. So how is it that somebody making a declaration of preference could get into legal trouble?
Oh, no, not the.
Okay, I think that was the.
That was the question I was asking.
So it should mean.
So you mean the person who is reading and consuming the preference?
Right.
That's why that to me is an implementer, not a user. So,
okay, thanks for clearing that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
And Ted, thank you for demonstrating the proper form of a clarifying question. You didn't clarify what someone else said based on what you thought. You actually asked them to clarify. Thank you. That's a bugbear of mine. Next
and
up.
it didn't take 20 minutes for it.
Yes. Timothy,
as far as whether to include text and data mining, again, this kind of goes back to like how these are interpreted. Often in a configuration, people will say either like no at the top level and then define their yeses to specifics, or vice versa. They'll say yes at the top level and define their like the specific no's. And so I think whatever we call the top level, I see being value in having that, unless we define a configuration system that doesn't allow either of those ways of doing things. But since there's been a decision to kind of do both opt-out and opt-in, it seems like we would need kind of a top level in order to accomplish that. I think it also, there's value there for potential things that aren't defined by this vocabulary. For example, like two kind of AI applications that are very contentious that people have strong feelings about is weapons and like biometrics or surveillance. And so, you know, if we include those in the vocabulary, I think that's fantastic. If we don't include those in the vocabulary, having a like top level will allow people to achieve their preferences without opting out completely. I think that we should be careful not to be too prescriptive as far as telling all the world kind of the best way to do this, or being scared that they're going to harm themselves in using this tool. And I think it's a little bit kind of, it's out, I think it should be considered out of scope to kind of prevent those kind of like down the line effects.
Thank you.
And using this as a starting point, thumbs up. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm up next. So +1 to using this as a starting point. Start minimal is like I'm totally good with that. I think the like kind of on the same lines of like what Tim and Robert said, right? Like and also like following up on what Matt said, right? Like people are sometimes discoverers, and one of the things that kind of like stuck with me is that there's this YouTube video by like I think Hank Green, like Mark and I were talking about it like a while ago, right? So when somebody was signing up for like putting stuff on YouTube, like the toss included pretty much anything they can do with it, like including like making like AI likenesses of somebody, like using that to make other stuff. So I would think like people are going to, at least some subset of people are going to be discovered. So again, to Sonia's point, right? Like Sonia says, hey, like we should not prevent like future users. But since people might actually want to prevent like some unknown users they may or may not agree with. I think that's why I like that top level stuff being there. Even though it may not always fit our needs, but I do see the need for like kind of doing both like opt-out editing and like specific guesses, or like if somebody wants to be permissive, Sonia, to your point, right, they could like, you know, specifically say no to things they know about, they don't want, right? Like, so I think having this top level container allows both these users, whether you're permissive, you know what you don't want, or you know what you want. Like either of them can be supported with the top level container. Is like one thing. And for the inference thing, I think it's like Martin who brought it up. Like I think people care more about the effect on them rather than like what it does. So if the inference kind of takes away traffic from them or some way to monetize the thing, they might be like treating that differently, like when they specify the inference. So I would think like something related to inference needs to be there somehow in the draft, even though it's minimal now, but I think it should be. I think it's
yeah, I'm basically going to roughly echo what both of you said, is that there needs to be some form of hierarchy, nested hierarchy, at least from where I'm sitting. I think it's maybe to be determined whether text and data mining is the sort of syntax or the like, parent category that we want to subsume all of the other categories. And I guess to that point, I'm good with it. It seems like there's like a broad sort of convergence around this term, and I think like that's generally good. If we can converge on that, why kind of try to reinvent the wheel? You know, but to your point about sort of not letting regulators sort of specify these things in following suit, I think that's also correct and worth examining. But I think in this case, it's actually we can probably accept it, at least from where I'm sitting. And in terms of the inference bucket, I think that's something that I think is kind of a catch-all that future charters can sort of expand on and add more granularity to it, as well as potentially generative AI training, despite being a little bit more well codified. Yeah. Anyway, that being said, I +1 the document. Oh, actually, just one last comment too around uses. I think, and I know we're not getting into enforceability here, but I think that there's something to be considered as we like give people the affordance for a lever to pull. Like, are we really going to give people a lever that ultimately isn't very effective for them? Because I think that we shouldn't do that. And when we consider sort of building around use cases in that case, rather than kind of what is happening like at a protocol level, maybe misleading people who are less familiar. So just want to be considerate as we sort of give people switches to turn things on and off to make sure that they're actually functional.
So this has come up a bit before, and it came up at the workshop, the enforceability. You know, there's very limited things that we can do in this room, and then I think it behooves us to communicate carefully about that.
Exactly.
One thing that you said, Suresh, kind of tweaked me in that, you know, that case of, you know, if there's an expectation that I'm a YouTube creator and I upload something with my preference in it, that is somehow magically going to change YouTube's behavior. That's not the case. That's an interaction between copyright law and contract law, and that's we can't change that in this way.
Yeah. Right, like, but at least being able to specify that and figure out like something.
Communicate very clearly in that, I think, is what. Paul, I think it's thank you.
Yeah, I have three things in response to things that I've said in the recent chat. So again, like I found it interesting that the comments about like that middle category AI training not being particularly useful came from, vaguely speaking, publishers side, right? Like, because I think the type of enlightened human robot reference that sort of like this speaks more to almost ethical concerns that maybe don't come from professional content producers, but rather from people who are skeptical about AI as a technology and want to opt out, like want to signal sort of like opposition to that as well. So like it's indeed like more this, don't use this for training weapons, or don't use this for facial recognition type where this falls in. Like I think the people involved in professional content production and dissemination probably will lean towards the more precise thing or the more general thing, but especially the category of sort of like normal internet users who do not necessarily engage in a professional capacity or as part of clearly defined value chains, like I think are a group of stakeholders that we ought to be mindful about when we're defining this, and who are really hard to get represented in these kind of discussions. The other, to Martin's point about inference, and I don't know if I fully got your question, but like one thing which I think also plays in the difficulties with inference, you're running into like fundamental rights concerns relatively quickly around freedom of expression, for example. Right. If it comes into a situation where you say you can't use it in the combination with a tool to express yourself, right? Like these issues like do not sort of necessarily present themselves at the training stage because it's often corporate actors, but they will present themselves with much more force in if you start talking about inference time uses. And so we need to be careful that there's another set of considerations that we need to think through at this stage.
I was more concerned about just building a proper taxonomy that makes sense.
Yeah, but like the building of the taxonomy is like more complicated at this stage, right? And then the sort of like I think I hear more people saying like we should keep the TDM or not, but I think another argument why we cannot sort of completely ignore the TDM umbrella category is if you want this to be workable, right? Like you will want to have some kind of vocabulary taxonomy, whatever you want to call that, that allows someone who uses to interpret and TDM opt-out in relationship to the other ones, right? Like part of that thing is that if you run into a text and data mining opt-out, you need to interpret that to also be a generative AI training opt-out. If you remove the umbrella category, you certainly have uncertainty about what TDM opt-outs or TDM rights reservations mean. And at least in the European context, like there is sort of endless, like there's lots and lots and lots of them already out there. So people who implement systems will need to deal with them anyway, and so it's better to include them in the sort of hierarchical definition. And I think I'll stop
here. Alyssa, go next. And Brad, Mark, close the queue unless you want to express a preference, but like keep it short again after. But after Alyssa. Alyssa, go ahead.
Quick clarifying question.
Yeah. Alyssa's.
Okay, sorry, I can't quite hear. So I feel like the discussion about the hierarchy has been instructive, but it also seems like there's the hierarchy of the definitions and like whether these different terms that that we've been discussing are subsets of each other. Like that's very useful to get clarity on, but it feels distinct from how we compose the preferences. And I think we should maintain that distinction. And I know we're going to talk, there's a different charter item, and we're going to hopefully talk about that more in the future. But it feels like you could have hierarchy or not in the way that these terms that are on the screen are defined. And that's a separate question from how you compose preferences about these different subsets. So I think it would be useful to keep that in mind when we're talking about the definitional piece. My question is, do we need to talk about agents and agentic uses? Because that hasn't really come up too much, and it feels, at least conceptually, like undressed thus far.
Yeah, I don't think we have to, but that's just my opinion.
We should at
Semi-informed.
least talk, we should at least talk about it, even if we decide not to do anything.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think if it's not in scope, it needs to be explicitly out of scope. But we should talk about whether it's in scope or not.
I think it fits into the,
Not today.
Oh, no, we're closing here. I'm sorry.
No, if you have clarifying questions or adoption preferences, you can say this.
That's it.
I think Brad.
Let's throw a hand grenade.
Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, just a very quick point. I think to Alyssa's comment about the hierarchy of these points, I think that the way that the box is constructed at the moment assumes that inference use cases are included in text and data mining, but I don't think that there's a basis to assert that. That's a very large question mark in TBD. I think for purposes of our conversation, we can draw a circle around sort of the more specific use cases, but I think because we are now proceeding from the basis of potentially having a text and data mining preference, which aligns with a legal framework, we need to be really careful about where we put the other subsidiary uses, which may not align with legal interpretation.
Yeah, I really wanted to double check that I understood something right before that you said earlier. So you talked about, you made this example of face recognition, for example, right? And you said these use cases is something that the general user doesn't understand, and so we need a more broad category. Is that what you said? Because it feels like if the actual thing I want to avoid is fake face recognition, and I only have the choice to select this broad category, that's actually negative.
I think that point was made by Tim and Robert, I think not by Paul.
I think I expanded on their point. It is again, like, I think a variation that if I made the point in response to like somebody slightly questioning the usefulness of the AI training category, so the middle category, right? Like, and if you need to choose between, like, the AI training category allows people to be relatively specific with relationship. I don't want this to feed into AI systems, but I don't want to sort of prohibit the entire range of TDM. But yes, like that, and this is going into implementation things. Obviously, like if you're only concerned about that, you could also, we're not at this stage, but you can use this vocabulary in its hierarchical way that you give single preference that disallows AI training, but allows generative AI. That would, well, like, we're going into details, but that would leave, assuming that facial recognition is done via sort of like old-fashioned AI systems that don't have the capacity to also generate faces, right? Which is probably not the case anymore. That would solve, that would allow you to target things. But this vocabulary is also not intended, and sort of like I've seen some things like the warning is, this needs to be simple to be implemented. We can come up with lots and lots and lots and lots of very specific use cases that cannot all be independently targeted by a vocabulary whose the intention of which is to be deployable by a multitude of different opt-out systems that operate in different contexts.
So, I mean, I think that's a good point, that like it can't be too complex because then people cannot use it anymore, right? But I feel like a lot of people are actually concerned about a very specific use case, and if they are not able to express that use case because these categories are too general, they might also be disincentivized to use that correctly. So I think, I don't know what the solution is, but I think both of these statements are somewhat true.
I think the problem that, not the problem, but one of you say correctly, and I would say the same, I feel, right? Like we actually lack a little bit of the data, what we know, like we have a very vocal community of rights holders who signal very specific challenges to their business models, right? And I think we're sort of addressing this specifically with the generative AI, and there's the need for having something around RAG, search, etc. like that part. I think we really do not have very detailed understandings of especially of a quantitative nature, like where really the concern, like how the concerns are distributed. That is something that that we're lacking at the moment.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think we need to, even so this whole thing need to be simple, I think we need to figure out to find a system that doesn't lead to an overly restrictive outcome at the end. I'm not sure how that looks.
But I think, like, again, maybe from a policymaker's perspective, that sort of like, I think to some degree, like the time constraints that we're under is in the policy context, like the primary sort of conflict or opposition that that many policymakers try to resolve is, broadly speaking, creators, creative industries that produce content and the AI model developers that use that content to train the models. So that is one of the dimensions that we know for sure that this really is a broadly, how to say, but that is a very real problem. That we need to address, like, and the other ones, like how they compare to, like, like I say, like it's really, really hard to get participation in these discussions from sort of non-professional content creators who produce things that end up as training data and have an understanding of what their concerns and priorities would be.
Sorry, one more question, because you have the legal background here. So
We're getting off track.
This part about
style.
You're having a discussion.
So are you in favor of adoption as the basis point, or no? You're still questioning that?
Okay. Not sure. Okay. So it seems like we have a reasonable amount of support for adoption in the room. There are some people questioning it, but a lot of people who think it's a good starting point. I've been keeping a list of the issues that have been popping up that I think would we could think of as a basis for the discussions that would follow. And right now that includes kind of the search and discovery carve-out and the nature of that, the whole nexus of RAG and inference time and perhaps agentic cases, the role of TDM, although it's a little Pandora's boxy to open that up, I think, but we'll see. More generally, the Eurocentricity of the language, which I think Paul already said needed some adaptation. The definitional questions around, what exactly is AI, that sort of thing. Mapping the vocabulary to actual preferences, where that takes place and how that takes place. In general, what the interface to attachment is. So, how abstract is the model? What are the actual protocol bits? The time dimension came up a little bit in terms of the applicability of the preferences, although I suspect that actually may be an attachment question, not a vocabulary question. And then two kind of interesting buckets, the whole spam filtering, offensive language, enabling other good uses, and conversely, the weapons biometrics and disabling bad uses. I think both of those, there's a little bit of risk of trying to turn this into a general content preferences framework rather than, fulfilling our charter, but our discussions probably will touch on that. So then if you take all of those into scope, and if I didn't capture something, please say so. But if we have that kind of list of, okay, these are the issues we need to talk about in this draft, the question is, are we ready to adopt? And then, like I said, so far I've heard the answer sounds like a yes, at least yes enough for us to go to the mailing list and issue a call for adoption.
Yeah, and I think like if there's something missing, we can add it by positive choice from the working group, right? I think that's the goal. Like start with the minimal set and then go forward if so there's like consensus to add more rather than try to do that in the first revision. So like I'm sure if there's something you think is missing, we can certainly discuss that and add it in, right? It's like 0-0 at this point. Okay, so. But is there something in there that you object to? Is like probably the bigger question.
Right. Where fundamentally is not a good starting point. Yeah.
I mean, so I think I agree that like starting with the minimum and then adding stuff is the right approach. The hierarchy part is the part that I'm very unsure about.
Yeah. I did have that in, so let me put that back in, like kind of the nesting / hierarchy. Yeah, I'll put that back in. And I think for us as chairs, the real tension here is we have this timeline. It's very aggressive. We want to ship something quickly that can address the policy context that we're in. And as Alyssa was saying, we also want to ship something that's meaningful because we may get not that many shots at this. If we spend the next year talking, that's not going to do anybody any good. So we're going to have to constantly manage that tension, I think.
Yeah, and I think the EU thing, from the draft, right, it's kind of referencing the EU stuff, right, because there's, for lack of a better definition, I would think, right, like, if you can kind of like somehow soften it by making it exemplary rather than like exclusive to that, like might solve that issue at least. Like, at least in my mind it would, right, like you will just say like, hey, we have this like top level bucket that's similar to this, would be a good thing. I don't know if that fits the EU's purpose, but it'll at least fit our purpose, that this is kind of like what is defined, and maybe you can add more things when other jurisdictions start defining it. It's like a possibility.
You could even have appendices for different jurisdictions.
Yeah.
Implementation status.
Yes.
I think it is, for example, there an interesting exercise to specifically look at other jurisdictions who also have a concept of TDM in on their books. The UK comes to mind. There's a couple of other countries, and see in how far this can be made in a way that is not sort of it's literally cut and paste from the directive, like that this doesn't change in. And I think the terminology, like conceptually, they are all very similar. Like what you say, exemplary, not by directly referencing it. I think in the vocabulary itself, we're saying it's based on the thing. That's what we're sort of trying to achieve. Like we also were lazy and we just copy and paste it.
Copy and paste might be the right answer in this case because it's a pretty good definition. It's close to what we would need.
And it may not have meaning in a particular jurisdiction, but that's okay.
I'm not sure if someone made a case for what's the harm of it being so EU relevant. Like, the EU is among other people, right? And there's only people who they kicked off this particular use. So I don't think it's a problem if it is like heavily inspired by EU language. And it also turns out to be useful for other people. It seems a strange objection to say I don't like this just because it happened to look a lot like language.
I think as long as it's not excluding other possibilities.
So who's it excluding? I've not heard who yet.
No, I agree that we should probably use it. I'm not making the case, but I think we just need to make sure. And I think Paul's sort of way to the way to test this is just to evaluate the broader definitions outside of the EU's definition of TDM is probably a good way to do it.
I mean, let me take a different slice of that. Instead of saying EU-centric, it's TDM actor-centric. And it tends to, it's biased towards the TDM community because the EU has that framework, which you went over, of you can do this, and you can do that, and we're going to put this in the EU copyright framework. Whereas, and that tilts the scales. It was a deliberate choice by them to tilt the scales for one party, right? When we go into other territories around the world that have not made that choice in that same way, that EU tilting towards CDM enablement. Specifically, mean like if you remember, there's the thing of sections which called it. I think that may be where we may have a sticking point because in places that haven't tilted in that direction but are tilting in a different direction, we may end up with conflict.
So far, nobody's either they're tilting in the same direction or they're not tilting at all. Nobody's tilting in the opposite direction.
Yes, but they may not be tilting there yet because they haven't had anything pushing them in the direction that would cause them to react to tilt. If I'm walking down the street and there's no wind blowing in my face, then I don't need a scarf because I'm not cold. To make the observation that nobody's wearing scarves, therefore things that scarves aren't needed is false logic. So just because today there's nobody tilting the other direction doesn't mean that people aren't going to tilt in the other direction. And so I just, in this conversation of to EU or not to EU, I still think it is a concern. I think tilting a little hard towards the TDM enablement is a concern.
But having the language of TDM still allows you to say very clearly no. Like you can always just put at the top level, get off my side.
Absolutely, and part of what I keep sort of in my own head going back to, and I think we want to avoid is it's always easy to say, look, we're gonna go do this, because you can always say no. If we go too far in one direction, then what's gonna happen is a lot of publishing sites or people specifying preferences are simply gonna go no, 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 and that doesn't really help the open internet. That's an outcome which is not desirable. And so keeping that balance in our minds as we work through this, I think, is critical to a successful outcome of our work.
Okay. So I think we're starting to get into discussing the issues, which is great. But
Do you want to have a break?
I was just thinking we should have a break. Yeah, we've made some progress. Let's lock that in. So we'll do a call for adoption on list. And for the rest of today, we're scheduled till 5. Let's break until 3:45. Is it worth continuing to discuss those issues? Try to make a little progress in a couple of them? Okay. So let's come back at 3:45.
You can see the beautiful things.
I saw it. Have you saw it? Well, the problem is the water goes away from you. You know, it's just.
You feel like a community.
Yes, it is. But it's monumental. You know,
Because it talks about
it's a big piece of stuff.
expression, but then also that in legal consideration, because it's just not, there's no legal basis. So this is why we kind of overview.
Yeah, like I think what we're to some degree all of us is.
These are the
And then our I follow because I'm sure this in the end, I have the responsibility done.
The thing I saw a test drive, it looked like an internet, well, no, we were basically it looked like an internet. He had formatted email. Submitted as
This is a list question from somebody.
Formatting was because it gets rendered. So like one version is like to format in Markdown. There's a tool that takes
What I'm pointing
and convert it into the XML you then upload it. So he should go, if he wants to know how to do that kind of stuff, if he looks at a website called Other Tools, IETF, Google Other Tools, IETF, there's a web page that will talk to the different formats. And I'm sure there's enough people who will be point the right direction after there, how to actually do it. So it is not, and let me be clear, because I forget, it's not non-trivial. It's hard. It can be hard.
Yeah.
And you can go with a thing with, why does it have to be this hard?
Some people may want to follow these preferences.
We have to work on
The analysis of copyright law, some people may just want to do the right thing and think it's ethical, okay, if these creators don't want that to use it such and such way, maybe they should do that.
No, so I mean, I agree, so I can use a picture, which is copyright protected, and I do something with a private image, share that, for instance, just kind of whatever, so if I put it on a web page, it's like, or if I put it, publish it somewhere. But I think there is, like, for expression of style things, so I generate a new picture which is created in the style of some artist, and there's even not even a legal basis for what's right there. Like I feel that's why the regulators are so concerned about it. And there's some discussion.
Go away.
I want to express
Well, like people do all these, like express all kinds of preferences, right? Like that is still like, there's two stuff as well, there's two stuff in here, like, so to some degree, like the style thing, like yes, the legal copyright doesn't cover that there would be surprised if at some point like some country comes up with copyright to cover different things, and then it becomes different, like then you need to make different considerations if you're based in that country. Like I think that is not something that we can do in the it's like so native. It's not through vocabulary, probably also like implementation, something like robots or something that can be changed at law level.
Except that's kind of the point where not really so specific in the preference.
Well, we're not that specific, like we're saying like, well, then how do you specific? Which is compared to all the other systems that are out there. Like, there's sort of like people with technology that you want to do, like, I think it's completely unrealistic to expect something like commercial or for the purpose of like only for peaceful purposes or something. It's, I've spent a lot of time with Great right? Great has 6 different classes. 90% of the public facing work do with trade computer jobs or sort of check is talking to people who come with the idea that if only this specific case, their specific case was addressed by a little twist from their perspective in the licenses, then this would be perfect, right? But that is there's endless amount of people who want like standardization to some degree.
Yeah, there's a very common name.
Sort of really cutting down on core concepts and not getting. That's the question about the hierarchical thing. We went so they tried most of the structures like multiple we were back.
I mean, I think so I don't know what's right thing to place, but I feel like the most important use case people are worried about is like my content is used to replace me, right? To generate something that has my style, and so I can keep my business model running. Or my content, it's kind of the same use case. My content is used to create value, but I can benefit from it because it's not taking back.
Or like I think there's a third variation on it, which is like my content is used, not even thinking like that is typical of it. Like I think that is the first one is the typical architectural visual artists. Making or maybe also translator. So the second is publishers they are like I sort of like this is killing sort of like the arrangement that we had before. We produce content, you bring us users, and like we share this for them, right? And then there is sort of like I think there is also another thing which is sort of like more broadly where even people who do not have a realistic expectation of sort of gaming on the upside, I think there is some people who also have this I don't want my stuff which is used as an ingredient for someone else's enrich, right? Like especially like the biggest companies in the world just don't use my stuff. Not entirely just Google and Microsoft and OpenAI is getting rich, right? Like that also like I think there's this sort of like I don't want to be part of.
But I think it's kind of the same situation. It's like this is a bad idea. They don't want to.
Yeah, or they feel like maybe it's so far out of their sort of like systems that they could have some kind of like reciprocity that is right? But it's to some degree like it's sort of like this idea is not a use of my work that I approve.
Yeah, you have to have
but
that
I mean, some of these
before that. Yeah, you have car, star,
X, preferences.
Equals.
Some of these things like the expression style, like is missing the other bases at the moment. I think so.
Yeah, maybe quote unquote, then
preferences is really matching. And the third part is really just a preference. Yeah, so I wonder how much we need to cover all of them, but you said more specifically, if we come up with broad categories and people don't feel they can actually address those categories, and they will not use it, or they will not use it in the right way, and it will be overly restricted.
Yeah, that is like, I think to some degree, the responsibility of.
Yeah, but it's not, they put it in the file. Oh, you put all that in the file? Yeah.
That is to some degree right now, like, for a lot of people, it's just like, okay, there is no meaningful way for me to get work. Assume you have like a vibrant ecosystem of 5 different sectors that all allow you to do spawning and some others to do this. And there's the thing, right? Like, if there's if you go to broad, like, certainly my stuff is not fine. If you go to the MO tab, my stuff is not fine. Like, I think that is actually sort of like something that relatively quickly will, like, people will formalize this, or it will probably create this entire streams of like its way of SEO. If you understand this, how you do these things. But I think it's hard to predict exactly without having something like this in place where exactly like the thing is correct.
Yeah. So,
but at the moment, like all of this like disproportionately benefits, like I think the big AI companies in this all and say that look, there's like we don't need to.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, like, how would you express something like, I don't want Microsoft OpenAI and Google to use my data, but like create or like open common crawl or like smaller companies that allow to use it. How would I express them? I mean, it's very, not specific, but this is kind of what people want, right?
Yeah, I doubt that.
JavaScript has some good parts. Yeah.
So I think by way of.
I don't like the browser because some of it wants the language.
Yeah, I think that I mean, like you're sort of like there is this sort of this component that I don't know, like, because like there's like yes, that's a unresolved part of it. Like it's extremely hard to resolve. I mean, that like other creative companies were dealing with classes and you find something how much. Yeah, because the only people who can define that are Meta.
Yes.
In their license, like they can go and
So
say
I mean,
like.
this is but like you can always apply, right? If Meta is a small company.
No, Meta like now has its license for the Llama models, which allows like just people who are like honestly get use it except like if you're sort of like almost as big as Meta.
Yeah. We're going to talk about for centuries about what SMEs are.
But everyone is a bit worried that we create a simple a model that makes sense,
but that's mostly
doesn't fit the people. It's not actionable on the other side. I think that's what we need to focus on, making sure that people understand how to use the model for their use case, and we understand.
I'm going to pull in a module to the left of the screen.
Yeah.
It's very hard.
Yes and no, right? Like that is sort of that is there, but like on the other hand, like there is, I think, at least I'm very aware in the European context, right? Like if the right so like creators community, that's people, right? Like they are very well organized and they articulate their demands, and that doesn't disqualify them from expressing like having a legitimate stake in this discussion that we need to solve for that as well. The problem, like again, it's sort of a bit of a representation problem, like that has plagued many discussions about like the internet users as such are like really shitty at expressing themselves in a coherent way.
Sure, and what we see right now is that people that they have a page and they have access to robots and things, they can get random stuff with a lot of things. So you see over the last year is that in that sense, I mean, it's not impossible, right? So it's not like the internet.
Sure,
But
there are
the
some
internet gets more restricted because people don't understand what's going on. Yeah, they don't have the right choice.
Yeah, but like by giving them like the generative AI training thing, which we know is a large subset of people is simply what they are concerned about. You steer them into the direction to make more precise statements that they are currently capable of doing.
I mean,
They don't have the tools.
yeah, but I feel like AI training is that's what I'm not meaning, because, you know, if I ask my AI system, they kind of just knowledge base, right? If I ask my AI system, you know,
The physics comes
something
up
where
with
you
like 10 bytes.
you know, what's the difference between writing a script that such a application might not type or
But that's
getting my
that's in the
assistant
inference. That's in the inference. That's not AI training. Like,
No, also-
no, it's not. Like the model needs to be trained. Like models have there's a two-stage process. Like you have like a process where the model is being trained. At some point, it's sort of more or less finished. Like that is something that is internal to the company, right? Like you arrive at a thing, and that is by analyzing large amounts of data and like deriving information from that, sticking that as well. That's what all of the categories that we have in the vocabulary target.
Well, like
We-
TDM is broader.
Yeah, TDM is broader. TDM is the but like.
But like from a research point of view, when you look at big data analysis, like there were kind of initially there were all kind of these systems where you store your data in databases, you try to distribute the computation, try to feed it together and so on. And then at some point, machine learning came up where you put everything in a black box to treat exactly the same thing. I have these large amounts
Most
of
of them,
data
that's
that you
fine.
can
Most
now.
of them are TDM, and like, that's the stupidity of the new definition that it is so broad.
Yes, but I
like,
mean, that's fine because the outcome is the same. I just want to analyze the data and want to have the result.
No, it's not fine, because like EU copyright says, like, you can say no to that. That gives an incredibly broad thing, and like other countries, like Singapore calls TDM computational analysis. Like, the copyright code in Singapore.
You know how, like, you know how I move from form to select, like how.
The UK has the same. The UK says text data mining is a sort of like thing that falls into the scope of copyright. It's a very, very narrow exception for like slightly more broad than the Article 3 exception in the EU, but like that's the reality that we're seeing with some legal systems have given sort of like have expanded the scope, which is copyright, to like a bizarre amount, like maybe that you can say no computer don't do that.
And this one is great.
But like that's the reality that we're trying to do. Like that is not like that doesn't get into, regardless if we define the term vocabulary or not, that doesn't change the reality. Like the vocabulary, like actually, they don't makes it easier to say that, yeah, sure, TDM is okay, you can also use it to also. But so like we're not gonna lose by not including that term in the vocabulary. We're not like changing the order. Like people are still make machine reproduction. They will need to deal with.
And we still need that top level hierarchical term. I don't care. It doesn't matter whether we call it food or we call it.
Oh, yeah.
We still need something that encompasses that.
So maybe I'm just like, I'm not sure that all
The TDM category is very broad. It's like, I don't like it. Because it's just that I plug back and I don't actually how everything
Based translation,
Yeah.
or I think also data.
Gary has an example on safety where you clearly don't want to.
No, you're training an inference, yes.
You're confusing, like, the point is, all of this is about training and inference. You don't have, like, this is not about putting something in the this is not using an AI model to ask a question about your data.
But I think training and was not useful to find something. They don't have to use the AI posing to do always about what you use.
No, but the problem is it's not, that, and once upon a time, that was true. But with the advent of things like LLMs and now SLMs and things like that, that's not been done. So now you have a model that can be used for many things. So you no longer have models trained
I
for
had
specific
question.
purpose. That is where we started with AI, no question.
What would you like to do for dinner?
It's not
Chairs
really-
are responsible.
No, we are not. Don't put that on.
But at least suggest that we should get that.
No. You're on your own.
No, just at least suggest.
Scottish American food.
That's like.
Go for some Scottish American food.
No, I'm saying dinner, that all of us, like a great group of people work together, have dinner together. That's what I'm saying.
Like from the perspective of publishers, that's.
Okay, we should get started again, no matter how interesting the side discussions are.
Yes, sir.
I don't want to stop, but.
So, as we said, we tried to put out a call for adoption on the list. We'll try and do that the next day or so. Either way, I think this issues list is relevant. Where would we like to start?
Do you want to put that somewhere?
I can put it into chat for now.
Oh, they fixed the copy machine, so everybody needs a copy. It's working again.
Oh, no.
Oh, and Markdown works in Zulip. That's so interesting.
Yep.
I'm using the actual Zulip client, by the way.
I think it's actually pretty good.
It's not too bad.
Yeah.
So I think the meaty ones here are probably the first two: search, discovery, carve out, RAG inference, time, and agents. Definitional questions, I'm not sure that face-to-face time is quite ready for that. Yeah, probably those first two are the ones.
Yeah, let's pick one and stick with it.
Quick question on one of them. Because it was as it relates to getting ready for tomorrow, which is where we're splitting vocabulary and attachment.
Sure.
And I think that maybe that may be a worthwhile conversation to have.
Just to prep for tomorrow in a way?
I'm sorry?
Just to help prep for the...
To prep for tomorrow.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. I agree. Okay. So as discussed, Paul's draft has a very kind of high level concept of the vocabulary. And indeed, if I recall, it is not even to the level of expressing the true preference in terms of positive versus negative. It's just the terms. Martin, your draft took the approach of defining it effectively as a string that can then be expressed in wherever it contained a string.
That's actually just a sequence of bytes.
Exactly.
So
octets, yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Doesn't care whether it's bytes or Unicode.
Right, and the implication there, I think, is that how much do we define centrally in the vocabulary where it happens in one place versus where do we allow a particular embedding or attachment or whatever you want to call it, define the syntax, a localized syntax.
I think it would be very helpful to have a single syntax, even if particular attachments or embeddings or whatever it is you want to call them have a different expression, as long as they map back to a canonical syntax that we can all agree would apply everywhere. So that tooling and whatever else can all just say, this is the string.
Right. We've done that elsewhere. I mean, like structured fields is now like that, where you have an abstract model and you define things in terms of the abstract model. And then you have a serialization format of that.
No, I was talking about having a single serialization format,
And
not a single abstract model.
Yeah, I would prefer the abstract. I have no problem with the abstract model. That's a great approach. I don't like the idea of a single serialization.
Can you say more?
Sure. Basically, if we look at Paul had that list of half a dozen different existing systems out there today. They each use different serialization models. Some are plain text, some are JSON, some are CBOR. Some could be other well-known serialization approaches. I don't see why any of those necessarily need to change their serialization model to address this functionality, but they all want to adhere to a common abstract model that addresses the mapability. And so to me, I would rather see us go abstract model and then not worry about serialization. Each attachment can define how to serialize to and from the abstract model.
That's not serialization, that's parsing.
No, well, parsing is deserializing.
Right. So
I mean,
if you're constructing an abstract model and that's the reference that you have,
yes,
then every single one of those needs a definition for how you parse it into that model.
Well, maybe. What I was starting to think was that you could define an abstract model and then in the same draft, maybe in an appendix, have the recommended or default serialization, but allow the freedom to use other serializations.
Yeah, I have no problem with that.
Yeah,
I would call it an
possible.
example serialization, not necessarily a default, but regardless, yes.
So you could say, and so the individual attachment mechanisms would either opt into that and say, well, we're using section 3.5, or we're not. We're going to use this one over here. We're going to do the work ourselves.
And as you said, there are lots of good examples of that. I mean, I maintain, so there's many of you may be familiar with a standard called XMP, the Extensible Metadata Platform. That's used in a lot of places. XMP is an abstract model with two defined serializations. One that's defined in the base standard, which is XML, and one which is defined in the secondary standard, which is JSON. To me, it works for the same reason.
Oh boy. Okay.
I'm not suggesting we use XMP. That was not my point here. my point was abstract model versus serialization to and from the model.
But I was suggesting use description fields. Ted.
I just wanted to ask if we are going to go with a multiple serialization model for the reasons that Leonard put forward, do we want to define the abstract model in a way that allows us to register the serialization descriptions so that people can write I have it in this CBOR-based serialization, and I want to take it over to this XML-based serialization. Is that going to be something we expect to register, or do we think people will go up and do it based on the abstract model? Because I worry that if they're going to, if everybody's going to roll their own on these CBOR to XML type things, that will end up in pain in the deployment phase down the road. As bad as it is to define a single serialization model, at least at that point we know everybody's going in and out of the same one if they're using a different format in the particular. So I'm not going to argue that we can't do it that way, that using an abstract model doesn't work, because obviously it can. But the more serializations you have based on the abstract model, the harder it's going to be to actually get interoperability when somebody needs to aggregate them from different parts.
I guess I'm in my mind wondering how much of a problem that's going to be in practice, because I suspect if we choose that recommended or whatever we're going to call it serialization carefully, it's going to be used in a number of places, and it's only in the formats or places where it really doesn't fit. People will define it differently.
Yeah, I think like Mark got it. Like I wanted to say as well that we should have a recommended one and let other things happen, so that allows for us trying to be minimal, but also allowing probably pre-existing conditions to either kind of ignore it at their own peril or come around at some point saying that this is the preferred one. So not default like you said, right? But recommended is something we can do, right? Just say.
Sure. I prefer something much stronger than here's an example.
Yeah,
I'm okay with recommended.
But this is the one that we're defining. If you want to define your own that match to the same abstract model, then you're free to do so, understanding the limitations that come with it and the risk that carries. And XML probably wouldn't be my first choice.
So you would not?
No,
mine would. Mine either. but I think the JSON, for example, probably would be.
It might be. Yeah.
All right.
Mark is thinking of something else. Yeah, sure.
Oh, Ted.
Yes, I think.
No.
keeping other things attractive.
No one's mentioning X693 then.
Well, I mentioned structured fields because I think it fits into robots.txt very easily.
It fits pretty much.
Yeah, that's the nice part of it.
Yeah. I think it's a little strict. But
Structured fields, so my draft has a canonical representation, which is just a straight up string that could appear anywhere, which I think is a reasonable basis for something like this. It just so happens that if it is a structured field, it will parse in exactly the same way, and that was delivered.
I mean, if we did use SF, I think it's subset of SF.
It is a subset of structured fields.
But structured fields assume single keyword value pairs, right?
No, it's much more than that.
There's a lot you can do with it.
So it's specifically defined as a dictionary with values that are tokens, and the tokens can only have a specific set of values.
Key names are tokens. Values can be a number of different things.
But in this case,
for
if they
your
are
subset,
tokens,
right.
then it will pass under the other rules as well.
And you don't use parameters, right?
I don't use parameters.
And they're not, can the values be themselves containers or other dictionaries?
It's a little more complicated, but I'm not using any of that complication.
Okay.
But structured fields can do quite a lot more expressiveness than what we would need in this context, I think.
And there's an RFC for structured fields?
Yes, 9641.
Thank you. Excellent.
That's a game, by the way. A lot of IETF people like, is what's the number for such and such?
Some of us play it better than others.
No, it's just like joking. You see people rattling on numbers.
Some of us create whole websites because we can't play that game very well.
I can do it for research.
So it sounds like the discussion is an abstract model with a recommended, preferred, default, privileged of some sort, serialization.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And that serialization is of actual preferences, not so there's that layer that you were talking about between the abstract vocabulary and the expression of a preference, which kind of adds the yes or no kind of dimension to things amongst them.
I got it wrong.
But then that is the line between, as you were asking originally, the line between vocabulary and attachment.
Yes. And then, right. And I think that sounds like a good approach. And then the attachment, leverage, reference the abstract model and or its default, whatever recommended serialization in that case, in the case of each attachment.
Okay. Are we still taking notes?
Yep.
90s, so.
So I think that's pretty good for that.
At least as a starting point
As a
for that
starting
discussion.
point.
Yeah.
Do you want to move on to another topic here? Do you want to talk about, well, do you want to start from the top, search?
Search and discovery carve out. So my take on this personally is that and I won't speak in the working group chair voice yet, but we're chartered to do AI preferences, not search preferences. And so that's why I like the approach that you took in your draft.
So I think this really doesn't work if you think about it in the context of robots, without having some sort of search recognition. If we are going to go with something like robots as the place that we do this, then the absence of a preference right now basically implies that search yes, everything else no. In a sense, that's not how it's been interpreted. It's been interpreted as open season yes, everything else no. Everything else being the epicenter.
So can you talk through that?
So I think that when people were constructing robots.txt files 15 years ago, the only things that crawlers were doing were indexing the web. And so there's a sort of implied thing that goes along with it that this is really just about search. But
that's not the case.
It's not really true, but
there was spottering far before there was Google and
There was
other. I mean, robots have been around since talk to Roy. You know.
Sure, but a lot of those sort of fit into the cracks, as it were, because the search was the prominent thing, and that reciprocity that we were talking about previously.
Sure.
I mean, search was the motivating use case to allow cross, not public.
Right. That's why it was there. Now, crawlers existed, and for research purposes and whatnot.
I would dispute you on the historical basis, but the practical, the common mind share around it. Certainly,
That's really the point I'm making. Is that the expectation?
That's what's formed the modern view of robot software.
And so, when we've added other things to it, and now the predominant use of crawlers is probably not search indexing; it's trawling for things to train models on. That's
depending on who you talk to.
Depending on who you talk to, of course, it changes.
But you made an assertion that
I don't think you can build this system within robots without having a specific recognition of search as a use. And if you don't put anything in there, and you could sort of assume that that search is allowed, but I don't think that's true necessarily. I think there are cases here where you want to allow other uses, and for instance, block search.
But let me just summarize real quick. My understanding of Paul's proposal was that search was explicitly carved out because robot subtext was seen as an adequate mechanism there, and that when you make assertions about AI, it's excluding search. So is that not adequate to that?
I don't understand how you can make that claim that robots is adequate for search.
Well,
I think in the apps, I think why we came to make that, because we discussed it with the abstract as a sort of step towards implementations, and in the abstract level, we could say that because let's not discuss the search question on this level, and let's just point to how search has been dealt with so far. I would even question that we all mean the same when we say search. Like there's at least three distinct things. Like I think one is what our current draft addresses is sort of like the indexing for search, the very traditional, you crawl the web, like build an index and you work on the index. But search is at least also implicated in, like directly implicated by the vocabulary via the mechanisms. Gary reference to that a lot of search is that the delivery of search involves like in later stages, classifiers, filters, etc. They're almost all AI driven at the moment, most of them, no. Anyway, like a large part of them is AI driven. So is that like that's a different sort of overlap between search and AI. And then increasingly, obviously, all of the like the use of what used to be conversational chatbots as sort of like front ends for some type of search is the third thing. And then you obviously have also the generation of like this generative AI experience type of you as a user access a search engine like that presents itself pretty much like as a user interface like search used to work. But on the back end, then it uses generative AI to produce search results instead of surfacing something that anyone else would. So there's, for me, like there's at least four sort of like overlapping areas. So like the term search, like I think we need to deconstruct that a little bit. Like I think there's different solutions, hopefully.
Does it matter how you are searchable? I mean, what you want, I want to be searchable. Does it matter how they happen?
It does. It certainly matters because the impact of the output can be helpful or hurtful, depending on if you are relying on the search result to send traffic back to you, simply answer the query without necessitating them visiting your site, which could result in the loss of advertising or subscription revenue. So I think it is the question. I also think the examples of how search has evolved and morphed are illustrative of why robots text doesn't seem to work very well for search anymore, because it is no longer just about search. Search is no longer just search. So I think that we should be open-minded in considering ways in which the vocabulary will not necessarily be built around robots text, but include, because it is so important right now, the ability to operate with it, but also look beyond that.
We do have a queue, so I would like to go through the queue. If you want to put yourself in queue for a longer comment, please go ahead. But Alyssa is first in the queue.
I guess, yeah, Mark's original question was like search or AI, and I just think search is AI. Like any meaningful search offering makes extensive use of AI. So we might think that we are skirting this issue by leaving something called search out of scope, but I actually think we're just leaving it vague and undefined. So even like understanding the appeal of that, I don't think that will achieve what people want. And I agree with, I think, Brad, whose voice I can now identify, who was just speaking. I think this is one of the central questions that an improved preference signaling framework can help to address. I don't think it's the only one, but I think if we don't address it, we're like already out of date. And if you look at the search experiences that are being offered today, they commingle multiple of the different uses that we've discussed this morning, during the day for you guys. So I think we have to confront this, and it probably requires some very tricky definitional work to figure out what the right top level categories are on the search side. But I think it sort of behooves us to make that effort.
Yeah. I hear you, Alyssa. I'm just concerned that is can be seen as a pretty substantial expansion of our scope, and that now we're addressing, all of robots.txt kind of, in terms of how it applies to search, reworking that.
I guess, Gary's there, so he can answer this question. I'm not sure that robots is actually that specific to search, right? Robots is kind of about crawling.
Yeah.
And what I really like about Paul's framework is that it is about the use.
Sorry, you're breaking up, Alyssa.
Sorry, what I said was that what I really like about Paul's framework is that it's about the use. It's about uses, and I don't really think robots is about uses. So I think search is AI, and that puts it in scope for this working group. And if we go with the use-based framework, then we should think about search uses.
And uses are definitely, AI uses are within our scope. Okay.
Joe.
Pass.
Okay. Timid robot.
Timid robot. I don't understand, and sorry, this kind of crosses with our issues, but I don't understand how we could have TDM as a top level and ignore search. I like the idea of TDM at the top level, and I like the idea of including search. And I think if we are going to exclude search, then we will have to be much more specific, and even AI might be too generic.
Leonard?
Yeah, actually, Alyssa said it best, and I agree with you, as Martin said. I think she framed it really well around usage and talking about it from that perspective. And that we are, as Mark, you reiterated, focused on AI usages and not non-AI usages. And then so totally agree with all that. The only other thing I would add is that, you know, when I think about this, to me, robots is just another one of these signaling mechanisms. I don't see it as special in any way, shape, or form, and we shouldn't treat it that way. That's one way in which you can apply these signals that we are defining.
Gary? Oh, it's me. So I was very young when robots.txt was developed, like teenager. But I was already on the internet, so I still have like some memories of that. And the problem was not search engines; it was crawlers in general. Because back then we had directories that were aggressively trolling, and then we had search engines as well. You cannot think of robots.txt as just something for search. Curl, CURL, added robots.txt support early 2000s, sometime, I don't remember when, he was also very young. And since about 2010-ish, there's an unreasonable number of SEO crawlers, which are unrelated to search. They are just like harvesting data for marketing purposes, whatever. I have no idea, for like analytics or something like that. But if you look at the Cloudflare dashboard for crawlers, then you still see that Googlebot is the predominant crawler. And Googlebot is indeed for search, like that only powers search. What?
You have one crawler that is multi-purpose, mean the Google Extended is.
So Googlebot is only search, and then with Google Extended you can control where it goes. But what I want to end with is that we should not consider robots.txt as a static thing. Like, we should be able to upgrade it, and because it was upgraded over the years. Like, for example, Yandex added support for canonical host field. Bing supports scroll delay still. Damn it. You should deprecate that. Yes. And there's other fields that were added over the years for whatever reason. So I think robots.txt specifically is a very good play. I think I'm talking about this tomorrow though. Is a very good attachment place because it's so widely used, and also its extensions are really good for like the robots HTTP header is a very good place for signaling preferences. But saying that robots.txt is search is just not the case.
We just released Copilot Search last week. What is Copilot Search? Is search augmented by AI. You see all OpenAI others moving toward a search that is augmented by AI. You don't want to have 20 destinations. You want to link customer to one destination that is relevant, and it's search plus AI. So I feel that this definition is clear. This is just we want to pivot it toward what does it mean again for search? What does it mean no TDM? Okay, for search, how do you translate this? How do you satisfy Matt and others in terms of requirement? And then +1 on robots. I will share that tomorrow.
I don't see anybody left in the queue, either remote or local. So I think we exhausted.
So the challenge here is deciding whether or not we include it and under what definition. And I think if we...
And how much granularity in those definitions?
If we can find a definition that we like, then that may push us toward inclusion. But if we can't find one that we like, then maybe it's not worth it. Ted had a definition, I think was based on something that I put together that was on the mailing list. I put it in the chat. It's not on the screen right now. It says, search is when you primarily give back links. Oh no, that's Yari's. Sorry, I really can't read this now.
I did. I posted.
Search application directs people to the original location of relevant content as part of this operation. Yeah. Or maybe you could say that's the primary purpose of this operation. Now, I think when you think about applications like Google search or Bing search or any of the people in that space, what they're operating is multiple applications in that one context. They have the chat bot style interactions as part of that. They have the tiles that show you the current weather or whatever it is. There's a bunch of different widgets. There's a search widget on that page, and I think that's one of the sort of uses that would be enabled under this, but maybe some of the other ones are not. If you were talking about search. So that's where I tend to fall on this one and think that search is very useful in that it does enable the sort of reciprocity that we were talking about in TED submission. It's very good on that one.
And we'll apply this one. Again, don't think search is search used as is used to be search. Search is also AI. And when we do a very good job at extracting a very good snippet for a query, again, Matt and Financial Times and others won't be happy because they will see maybe no click. And they want to control the snippet. They want to control the use of the data. They want to control to get some clicks, maybe. And so this is where search itself is not the search of 20 years ago. It's really AI augmented to surface the best content, to really deeply understand the content, to do machine learning and more on the content, to really surface relevant links and great snippet that may attract the clicks or not. And this is where there is, there is a tension here. And so this is we resolve by standard as such to control usage of the data in search and AI in general.
Right, and I think we fall into a trap when we start talking about expectations that people will follow the links or anything along those lines. Because as you say, the snippets are getting better and more relevant and providing the information that people are searching for. And we can't really stop the evolution of search as a product. And of course, it's all AI, as pointed out. But when you look at one of those applications, it's the purpose of that is to get predominantly to get someone through to the original content. Right? So you're searching for content on the web. You're not searching for content on this very search engine web page. The search page that you get is not your destination that you have in mind when you search.
I agree with you, but again, the complaint not coming from me, coming from Matt and others, is that the fact that we are preventing the clicks if we do a very good job. And they somehow want to control us by offering a way to click.
And I think that's going to be a constant tension between search engine providers and content producers as to what that relationship looks like. But at least it's to some extent a mutually beneficial arrangement because you drive attention towards their websites. They provide you with content that causes people to go to your website, and I think that's, as long as that remains the focus of that interaction, we can try to find a definition that encompasses that and call it search or indexing or whatever it is that we think is appropriate. And I think we need to have something like that in order to allow for those carve-outs.
I would be curious, just to sample across the room, again, if we accept the premise of if we accept the sort of nested hierarchy that we put up there, where folks would position this in that diagram, and if people would accept this, it sounds like people are converging on or agreeing upon the fact that search and AI training are synonymous, whether it would just fall into the category of just AI training, and we could make an addendum that says search as well, or if that would, yeah, I'd just be curious to sample the room to see where people would situate this, even if it's spanning multiple categories.
Personally, I'm starting to see, training a general model as a use, all these as uses, searches and use with specific characteristics, augmentation of results, and they're almost peers. I'm not sure that training is more general than search. That's just me.
What else? I think we can probably answer this question relatively simply. I don't think this needs to be a neat hierarchy with one thing under the other. I think to a large extent, search and AI are concepts that are very much overlapping, but they're not exclusively the same. So we may not have a direct, this is an exclusive subset of this other thing, such that you could say a preference at the top level cascades down to the level below, but having those tiers is probably the right way to do that.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think in terms of, so we can kind of all look at the model and agree.
Yeah.
And maybe just, I'm not sure the best way to visualize this or to think about how we want to make this as a category, or if even that's the right path to proceed, but
I'll draw a picture, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it would be interesting to see how people would map this, just to see if we're even talking about the same thing. I mean, just as we try to migrate towards the syntax, I think that's useful, at least in terms of the utility of where search is within this. Thanks.
So I want to go back to a formulation I used a little bit earlier today, and to say, in large part, what we're talking about are three different systems: data acquisition, data analysis, and actions that are derived from that data analysis. And I think when we're talking about search, the data acquisition has been relatively constant. People follow links, they go off and gather data using crawlers. That's kind of how that works. So the data acquisition side has been very static in some ways. The data analysis has changed over time, right? The original data analysis that was putting forward in the document that was referenced up there was based on doubling core and keywords. That was rapidly gamed, and it was a kind of a cat and mouse game where the analysis moved toward page rank and then beyond toward other things that tried to make sure that when we gave you relevant content, that relevance was in some sense ordered. But it was always to give you the places to go on the web that related to your query, right? So it was a search for places to visit that had the data you were looking for. Over time, that action changed as well. And I'm not sure if when Gary joined Google, but it was a very definite statement by Larry to Google: we don't want people just to come to us for where to go anymore. We want to be able to provide them answers instead of locations, or as well as locations. And that transformation to go from the action of providing locations to the action of providing answers to the question meant that search, as Google provided it, changed from what it used to be to something that rapidly, as AI and generative AI came in, ceased to be as cooperative or as collaborative as it did before. And I agree with Yari's point in chat. There's a spectrum here, and that wasn't an overnight change. I think when we're talking about it, we have to acknowledge that the first bit of this, the data acquisition side on the web, hasn't changed much. The analysis is not actually exposed to the end user of the system, and won't be exposed to the person who expresses preferences in any meaningful way, right? You can say something about the analysis that's being done. You can say, I don't want generative AI, but that's really the action. You're not going to say, please don't use this particular set of weights. You're not going to say, please don't use this particular model building mechanism, you're actually talking mostly about the actions. So I think when we're talking about how we structure this document for the consumption of the broader ecosystem, what Alyssa said earlier is spot on to me. We're ultimately wanting people to pay attention to what actions are being created, given the inputs that we're allowing them to acquire. And so you're saying, if you have assets which may be acquired by this system, you want to express a preference on what actions can be built up. And the pipeline of how the analysis takes place, is it PageRank, is it an AI model, is it something else that they're using to build the relevance tree to provide this, doesn't make as much difference as whether they're trying to give you an answer or a location, as those are two different
Okay. Brad? Okay. Matt?
Yeah, it was just to add, I think this is often seen as like, this is about clicks thing with publishers, and it's about us losing out on revenue. But there is a much more pervasive and sort of insidious side to this, which is, I'm just reading another report today about a chatbot getting quotes from news organisations completely wrong, fabricating them. This is in relation to political information about an election. So actually, this is as much about giving news publishers the opportunity and the choice to decide whether we allow our brand and our content to be used by generative AI companies to provide inaccurate information to users, because we don't really want to be part of that world if the models are going to be unreliable. Another thing I'll say is, like, we've tested all of the kind of paid for and free chatbots that are available on the market using highly paywall content that we've got around investments. And some of those models get to a point where they reach the paywall, and then beyond the paywall, they just completely fabricate like investment advice from some of our most trusted columnists, to the extent that they put like, what's the rationale for investing and not investing in a very neat table, which looks like it would be very user-friendly, all completely fabricated. So this is not about clicks and about revenue, it's about brand and about the information ecosystem, and us being able to decide whether we want to be part of that, or whether we, as a premium journalistic brand, stay outside of that and provide a kind of premium product to our consumers.
Timid Robot. I think I really like the kind of the organization around use or action, but I do think that that should be on kind of both sides of AI and include crawling, because I think that like crawling itself has a significant impact. And while I would hope that a company might skip my content if they can't use it, I think that it should be explicit that I want them to skip crawling my content, instead of just kind of hoping that they recognize that that's not cost effective to them, so that like my server isn't handled.
I wonder, a little bit inspired by Ted's thing, if it's not so much the concept of search that is the most important here, but rather the concept of finding something, like being pointed to something. Like I think in the policy discourse it's often called findability, which is a bit of a strange word, but that is like a tool that helps me being found. Versus, because search, I can search for answers, I can search for locations, I can search for advice, like that's it. I think the key concern is about being, like getting traffic being found. So maybe starting to define it around that concept might be easier than starting from the front door, like start with the result, not with the search code.
even within this nested hierarchy framework, surely it wouldn't be possible for us to add like an on button for search in the very traditional blue links kind of way. And then someone could say, I don't want to work in any LLMs which are going to hallucinate. I don't want to be ragged because it's going to steal my revenue. But I am happy for you to use whatever you might need to use to build a search engine, whatever TDM that involves. And essentially you guarantee for some developer you're happy with them to use whatever tools they have to just to provide additional search projects. Everyone seems to know what search is. It just we accept that it involves some TDM in the process of delivering a traditional search product.
I think that comes back to, Paul had that kind of taxonomy of different kinds of search and kind of nailing that to the wall and then defining the semantics of each and then giving that flexibility.
But I think a good example would be Facebook would say what it's doing with its external fetcher, it's creating a search index. But in reality, what it's doing is creating a RAG database. Right. So it's actually delineating between those two explanations about what they're doing is quite.
Does like Ted's definition of like getting the attention back to you, would that be like a high level enough definition that kind of goes around this topic? Like the idea is to get back the attention to you, right? Like rather than to like provide an answer. Would that be enough, or do we need to spend more time?
I don't think that's enough because that may be. It really depends on how search is implemented. In some instances, it may create some traffic. In some instances, it may not. I think it's too abstract and it's too outcomes based. How would you show? And the same action could be different results. So I think for me, the dividing line is the summarization of content and provision of that as in response to a query. I'm sure that there is a much more elegant way of describing it, but that really seems to be where the line is divided, and I get why we'd be reluctant to redefine search rather than approaching it from the perspective of what can be carved out of what is already understood by everyone on the internet right now in terms of what they allow and don't allow for traditional search.
No, I'll put myself in queue. I do have questions for you. Martin?
Yeah, I'm still not clear on where your line is. Can you just quickly do that before I jump into that? You said you had a line between...
The line would be where content is content summarization. Instead of something, whether you use it for search or you use it for some other purpose, the summarization of content is very different to saying, hey, let me help users find
it. Okay, right.
As opposed to, I'm going to create a summary.
So for you, potentially the finding is okay, but the summaries maybe on the other side.
So it's about redirecting to the original source rather than answering a question directly.
Yeah, but realize that may involve summarization as well. It could be a summary and a link, and there's a qualitative difference between just a summary and a link. Okay. So it's really a kind of a condition on the use.
Yeah, I guess where you put a final point, it's the difference between, because now we also have snippets and extended snippets, but there are already degrees of control that you have over those things that exist right now, and I don't think we want to disturb that. It's a question of, now we're going beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, Gary may remember this.
I think, Martin, was that your question?
I want to hear what Matt has to say.
Okay. No, but Alice has to be.
So, yeah, just to build on that, there was a period where Google was going to change the headline that appeared in search from a news publisher because they were going to do it in a way which is more user-friendly. That's implemented. Now, the structure of a headline that a news organisation has put out into the ether is extremely important because it could be for legal reasons that you have structured a headline as you have. And if it's structured in a different way, it creates legal risk to the publisher. So I think the point is, a kind of traditional search to me is that the artifacts that are in search are intact. And we've seen search evolve. You get one box that's come into the search so that you kind of answer the question within that context. But they were always the publisher labeling content and putting it in a schema that was in their own terms. The difference with AI is that AI developer takes the content and reframes it in terms of they've determined. And that is the challenge.
Sorry, in copyright terms, this is the difference between the right to reproduce and the right to modify.
Right. So I asked for screen sharing because I just briefly wanted to show something that I think might is the expanded version of Paul's.
You have the rights, yeah.
Jeez, this is terrible.
We love you, Medeka.
Oh yeah.
What do you mean? Why Medeka?
Is that visible?
Yeah.
It's
beautiful. So,
I think Randall Monroe is looking for some help.
Yeah, that's good. This is, I think, the expanded version that we were talking about, which sort of recognizes that there's no clean hierarchy between search and other things. Search is both training and inference, and sometimes just getting something, right?
It's Gen AI.
It's all of these things. And yes, it's Gen AI. I didn't draw that in because it would get a little complicated, and Gen AI was an afterthought. It's all of the things, and so it doesn't have the sort of neat nesting structure that Paul's diagram had, but that's okay, because we don't need to have a neat nesting structure throughout all of this, and recognizing that the true debate here is around exactly the things that Brad was talking about, and the things that Matt's concerned about in terms of being able to say that the application packages things up in a particular way, subject to the usual tussle around those things that you have back and forth with search providers. Carving out that space, I think, makes a lot of sense to me.
Alyssa, then Paul, then Wilson.
So I think one thing that seems to be emerging, at least for me, is that it's really important that the like these categories or the items over which one can express a preference are discrete and meaningful to the people who want to be able to express these preferences. So we've heard a little bit of that from some of the publisher folks in the room, but I think that's like a really important question for wherever we land on this, is like, does this allow a broad swath of different kinds of publishers and content creators to express a preference which to them is meaningful? Like, it makes a distinction between two things where one they might want to allow and one they might want to disallow. And if we don't disentangle the things sufficiently to make it meaningful in that sense, then we haven't really done our job here. So I think we probably need to consult a bit widely with different kinds of publishers to see what that set of preferences looks like, and where to sort of draw the line as was trying to be done in the room. The other thing that I was glad that Matt brought this up is about, I guess in my mind, I had been thinking a bit of as accuracy, but it really seems like it's about like faithfulness to the original content. And that seems to be a bit of a dividing line. Like, will my content be used in a way that where it is faithfully reproduced? The headline example is a great one, versus uses where that can't be guaranteed, or where it's not expected or not the primary outcome. And that seems like maybe an additional dividing line that seems important, at least for some publishers, that what the use of this is will be faithful to the original, as opposed to, anything else, I guess.
Yeah, it makes sense, Alyssa. Thank you. I think you covered what I wanted to say. I think it's more.
I still wonder if we go to your diagram, like in the diagram, like I think there's still two different conceptions of search in there, because the attitudes that I get from many publishers is the one thing in that sort of old style pure search that is generally, we want to not even allow that, we want to be featured in that. We want to make sure that we're not excluded from that by virtue of us signaling something else. So that's one, that makes it a separate target from, like, I think what you described, this sort of like AI enabled new forms of search that make use of sort of a bit of generative AI, a bit of inference in the process, and all of these things. So like I think those two need to be independently targeted unless that sort of like old-fashioned search goes away anyway within the next 6 months, which might also be the case. So I think then we don't need it as targeting.
Yeah, I was talking primarily about the old-fashioned 10 blue links style of search, which has obviously evolved considerably over time, but it still sort of presents similarly. Whereas I think the little snippets you see at the top, or the answer to the question, or what have you, is a different product.
But what I'm referring to is sort of like there's two ends of the spectrum of attitudes towards search. One is like I absolutely want to be included in this unfair business practice to exclude me from that, and the other, like this has so little to do with search as we know it. Like I don't want to be like it creates this sort of like brand reputation issues for us. And that speaks towards that being like two different sort of elements of the vocabulary because you would need to be able to target them separately.
Sure.
I think Hiro-san was next.
Okay, so regarding your TDM diagram, I think the search engine term is very unclear. The original search engine just implemented indexing, but they recently provides some kind of caching, and they can display the cache content. And also the search engine implemented some kind of multimedia search, like a Google image search. It displays the thumbnails. So I think when we think about the multimedia, I think it's out of scope of the TDM, I think. So how do we define the search engine here? So that is my question.
So I think you'd be able to express the preferences about any type of media, not just text. So if the media is being expressed about images or about movies, you would expect a similar vocabulary to be present.
Or to be applicable in exactly the same way, just for a different medium.
Yeah. Which one? It would be applicable in the same way, just to different media.
So that would be along that particular dimension, the different types of medium that the content uses, you would not differentiate within the vocabulary. So if your image appears in image search, then it appears in image search, and you would be able to express a preference in exactly the same way as you would for text.
So, so I think I agree. We can use the same way before the multimedia.
Unless there is a specific reason to do that, I would prefer not to add more dimensions to the complexity. I think search is already adding a dimension of complexity to this, but I think it's an important one.
Timid robot. Yeah, I think we're dealing with the intersection of two misleading terms. And we've talked a lot about how to clarify the term search into its components. Whether it's a summary, whether it's like links and a portion of the page, etc. But I think the other part of the problem is AI, like AI training, and I guess I would want some clarity on like we say that like everything is AI now, right? We're using AI both to mean like a computer process and also to mean kind of a system that can like generate new things. And I think that I have some confusion kind of about whether however things are indexed now, whether that kind of qualifies as AI training? And do we need, like, is there value in talking about AI training at all? Because it is kind of so amorphous. And should we instead go back to kind of like ignore the I think you said analysis?
Yeah.
Ignore the analysis and focus instead on the action. You said actions, other people have said use. And so, like, as far as the diagram goes, like remove AI training, potentially remove AI training, which is referring to that central analysis portion, and see how we could map things out based on activity or use.
And one of those activities would presumably be generating some output. Generative output. Just a time check, we're scheduled to end in a little more than 10 minutes, so.
Santiago, Joe, Paul.
Okay, so I have two questions actually. One is, if we don't worry about the terminology and just kind of clarify where the line is, it seems to me the carve out should be in or between being able to generate summaries and not generating summaries, even when those summaries are accompanied by links. That's something that you want to completely be able to opt out of. And then I guess the other comment was in relation to Tim's comment on taking training out entirely, because I think that was initially the scope as I'd understood it, and focusing on use. I think we do need to be quite careful as we think about that downstream control of use, because I think that kind of sets up a completely different framework in terms of what our concerns are. Because, say for example, we're talking about publishers and search at the moment, but I think imagine the context where you have maybe scientific research publishers controlling the use of a model for heart disease versus lung disease. Is that kind of where we want to end up in that kind of framework? It feels, and it also feels that that's kind of something that would be quite difficult for open source development, because when you're putting additional constraints on the use of models. Yeah, just a comment really. I think the world of actually controlling downstream use feels quite a dangerous way to go for this thing.
I would just say that if we don't tackle downstream use, we will end up with opt-out, just like blanket opt-out. I think that, kind of going back to earlier points, giving some specificity will allow people to participate where they would otherwise just completely no out.
Joe. It sounds like people want, people as in like consumers in the broad sense it sounds like people who supply the data, who are working these websites, want to be able to specify the product they're going to appear in. Like, I do and don't want to appear in a classical blue link search. I do or don't want to appear in a chatbot. I do or don't want to appear in like RAG summaries. And you could do that, and that maybe like short circuits this whole complicated hierarchical overlapping problem that we have. And then you get Sonia's problem, which is that if you say I don't want to be involved in chatbots, then you opt out of everything. And I hope you're saying, Timid, about, well, otherwise people are going to opt out by default. I think it's then worth considering what fraction of web users do we expect to take a proactive consideration of what their opt-outs are, given that a lot of web users' content is going to be on social media platforms where it's not relevant, and the biggest providers might be people like news media organizations who are going to do things that are anyway and will have relationships with big tech companies. So I think where I'm going with this is we now need to start thinking about who is going to be using these and how many internet users and sites we expect to be affected. Otherwise, we are going to get situations where you can't do stuff for heart disease because everyone's opted out because they're worried about they're going to appear in some commercial product they don't want to be in. Also, this is going to be a wrap.
Sorry, I will just reply quickly.
Yeah.
So the largest fraction of the internet is on some publishing platform like CMS. That would be WordPress, I think, right now, which is the biggest one, followed by other ones. But a very large fraction of the internet or section of the internet is actually on CMSs. And usually they add these opt-out, opt-in settings in bold for everyone. So for example, on WordPress, you have in your admin panel a setting that you can opt out of search. And I would imagine that very soon after we come out with something from these meetings and from this working group, WordPress is going to add something very quickly. That would mean that we will have, especially if it's in a very accessible place like robots.txt or some of the headers that we have, which means that we will have like 40% of the web adoption in no time. And usually people start poking around. They will notice it. They will start talking about it. And especially the WordPress community is incredibly active. Like they talk to each other. They have a very active forum. There's going to be like very quick adoption for whatever we release here. Also, you have to think like, especially if Bing and Google and Mozilla, for example, like we are all on board, and we are going to talk about it too. Like there will be probably keyword posts, whatever the blog is for Bing and Mozilla.
And never mind things like what we might do.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and then the Cloudflare kicks in. It's like, hello.
So I want to just caution against it. Like I think we are somewhat handicapped here in the room by the people who are in the room. That the only rights holder representatives are press publishers who like see a business in like who could almost
television, sports, movies, a lot of those.
The point I'm trying to make, like you can go to the use of these areas. There's a huge class. Publishers of books, like visual artists, like who are concerned about the training part, about the use of their works in the training process. They see this as a source of licensing revenue. There is deals that are being made between big AI companies to gain access to the output of like trade publishers, sort of visual, like stock photo agencies, etc., who are not these inference type users. They are used for training the models. They argue that the use of their materials contributes value to the models that are then put into like commercial circulation, and they want a part of this. Those entities are relatively underrepresented in this room, and so the argument that we can ignore that middle part, like I think ignores the economic or the business models of a large class of rights holders who are not represented here. A lot of the policy discussion at this moment is about the training of models. And sort of like the policy discussion about the use and inference time in RAG lags behind. Most of the court cases that I am aware about are about the use of protected works in the context of training models. It's not about like the sort of like there's a smaller class, a smaller cohort of cases that deal with the sort of RAG type uses. But we also need to solve for that problem. And the other thing is like we're caring about stuff that's on the internet here. That's I think our purpose of this thing. But the way we propose the vocabulary, the way we have the discussion, that also needs to work for other systems that maybe address more these things, like how can sort of owners of photo libraries, how can sort of entities like large publishing houses of trade publications where the internet is really not the main dissemination channel, like also express their preferences with regards to the use of their works for training. So I think if we're limiting this on sort of like this very online consumption of relatively fast refreshing content, we're like only looking at a part of the problem. And I think we need to look at the wider problem in order to make this something that is meaningful to like a wider range of stakeholders.
Angela?
So I got a lot of comments. I'm going to go in reverse order. First, your example of scientific data and medical data for training and other purposes, that's the reality today. Typically, research data, if I lie, comes with a built-in limitation in the contract that I can't use it for secondary relationships I have with other uses. I have a specific use I can use it for, and that's it. And so the scenario you described as fearful that you do want to have that as an outcome is actually more or less the real business related today of opt-outs for use of scientific data for other purposes.
But not for training.
But for other uses. And so one can make the leap that when training becomes a more common thing, that these parties that own the data today or control the data today become aware of, they are going to want to opt out its use of training. And so then I'll go to the sixth comment about these other parties that are represented in the room. I think you're right, and I think we do need to deal with it. Because one of the things we've heard through the years from many of these other parties is they would like to participate in this bigger market space, but they have been excluded. The reason you don't see court cases is they don't have the money to bring the court case. But they have expressed through the years frustrations at other parties, not training AIs, but other parties looking at their work and reproducing it. If you, like, for example, the creative people on Etsy who create jewelry have often complained, they create, they publish it, and then they walk into a major retailer and they outsourced it in mass production. So they do want to be able to create the rights and control it. So we're originally having to, like I said, in reverse order. In the framework we have discussed today, one of the outcomes I can imagine for high value commercial content, which is sort of the area I come from, is that we would probably by default opt out. The safe bet is to say opt out. Where people want to do training for purposes of relationships I have with them, I would probably create a direct, non-internet based general training regime and a direct data contribution where you want to train against my movies, fine. Let's create a contract. I'll give you access to my library through some other means other than the open internet. And for this stuff we're talking about, here's the AI preferences. I'm just going to issue a default, no use, thank you very much. If you want to have something else, contact my lawyers, we'll negotiate something. I can see that being the outcome, and it's not a hard thing to see. I wonder if that becomes the default, is that an outcome we want? Because that's not a very useful outcome. It simply says do nothing. And we don't need a large grammar to express the phrase no. We just need one term.
But you need no but.
No, contact me. Here's my address. No, here's my address. And while I can see as an outcome, I'm not sure that's a really productive outcome for the growth of the internet and for a richer content experience for everybody. And I have one final comment, and that is, I think we're also limiting ourselves somewhat looking at the last war, which is search and summaries and stuff like this. More and more, one of the concerns that I've been involved in discussing is where the content itself is custom generated or created based upon interactions. So less search, more, I want to see Star Wars, but instead of the Star Wars characters, I would like to see Captain Kirk as Darth Vader. Make this, but I want minions, right? I want minions and I want to look like minions, but get a wizard in there with a wand.
Okay.
And I'll finish up.
We're over time, so I'm going to ask the remaining people.
So let's fight the next one up, only off.
Okay.
And I agree with it.
So let's get through it quickly.
Okay. Matt. Okay. Ted.
So I'm thankful for raising the point that there are other kinds of folks who are not going to pay, obviously, the process is going to be open, please invite them. And I also wanted to say, when I was talking about the three things, acquisition, analysis, and action, I think in many ways what you were talking about are actually actions, right? Somebody is being paid for this, and I gave resources and I'm not participating. The action includes the fact that they're getting paid in a way that impacts people from whom the assets will be acquired. The main point I was going to make, though, is we can't actually look at what's going on inside the analysis inside Google. A long time ago, when I went to patent training, they said, deprioritize patents where you're never going to know if somebody is infringing. And here, I think we have to deprioritize our work on the parts of the system that aren't inspectable. The acquisition side's very inspectable. We know somebody's hitting your site. The output, if it's on the public internet and not an API, as Glenn was saying, is also inspectable. That interior part that people talk about is because people market this as AI rather than because they actually understand what analysis is going in. There's so many different things we talked about under that I don't want to hand somebody an ontology and say, pick which forms of fast statistics in a tall hat you're willing to allow and which ones you're not. We have to get them to focus on what they actually can see and do. And I think that may not mean ignore the center slides, because we may have things we have to say about it. But I think the more we focus on that, the less effective at the end of the day we can be, because it's very fast moving, and we can't see when it changes.
Alyssa.
Matt will take back to you, so we have him back with you after.
Oh, okay.
Alyssa, and you.
I wanted to respond to Paul, and maybe I'm confused, but especially based on what Ted just said, but I didn't hear anybody advocating for not including AI training in the taxonomy here. So I think what we're talking about with search is like an additional category or a refinement, as Martin's lovely diagram showed us. But I don't hear people saying like we shouldn't address AI training because we potentially want to address these other uses. Now, maybe Ted disagrees based on what you just said, because obviously AI training is very opaque, and you may never know if your data was used to train a model or not. I don't actually think that opaqueness is a good barometer here, because there's a lot of these uses that we're not going to be able to inspect, but I still think people should be able to express preferences and use those as the basis for their own, advocacy, litigation, whatever. But I hear a lot of consensus in the room that AI training should fully be included, and I do think that's an important use case, but that the publisher and search use case is also important.
Just to say, there was a study from the University of San Diego, which was with creative artists, which showed that the majority of people they spoke to, their content was hosted on a web server or a CMS that wasn't capable of respecting robots.txt, and they couldn't amend the robots.txt file. So actually the ability for those people to opt into whatever comes following this is going to be very, very difficult to have to change completely where they host their content. And the other thing on the medical bit is, medical research, scientific research, most territories have a carve out for this to allow it to happen. When it comes to the use of an individual's medical data for training, that is the most sensitive end of AI, and the area where governments have to convince citizens that actually there is a bargain there in terms of I use your medical data, it's anonymized in some way, and you get this outcome at the other end of it. So it seems to me just giving it away, not having an opt-out for those people, or not having an opt-in for those people, is absolutely not what we should do.
Yeah, and I wasn't meaning any private medical data or control in scientific research.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up for today. Quickly, remote folks, how was the AV today? Were you able to hear everything?
Most people are audible. Ted is soft, but I know Ted's voice, so I can hear him. But that's not good for everybody else.
You've trained your model on lots of input from Ted. Okay.
The image is totally blurry on my end. Like the video is not adding a 10.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, I confirm on my side.
Sorry, Stefano?
I confirm also the image is blurry on my side, and I could hear most of the people there, but not everyone.
Okay, we might play with things a bit. Sebastian?
It's not always clear who is speaking, so Timid Robot mentions this name all the time. I think that would be a good example.
Okay, let's try and get in the habit tomorrow. Yeah.
We can't see all of the room either, but maybe that's just a camera kind of
That's a limitation. of hardware.
Impossibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
good.
yeah, more focus would be good.
One thing we can probably do tomorrow, like to avoid this like who's speaking thing, is like get everybody in the meet echo. I think like it makes the queue management easier as well. So if everybody can join the meet echo, so all you need is a data tracker account. You don't have to pay anything. But like maybe that's something. If you don't have one, we can. If you come in earlier tomorrow, we can help you like get on it. But then we can just say like everybody's in the queue. Everybody knows who's speaking.
I might rewrite and maybe not to do in your chat. Okay, we'll figure that out tomorrow. The next question I had was tomorrow morning we had the notion that we would start talking about attachment. I am kind of wondering if it may be more productive to continue this discussion on the issues on vocabulary for a little while in the morning. What do people think? Because we do seem to be making some progress, and I do think that a lot of this is foundational.
So I wonder what we want to do with Tom's draft.
I think we can use it as a source of issues and proposals, basically.
But do we want to or something and see what?
No, I don't think so. If someone has a specific portion of it they want to raise as an issue to discuss, certainly, but not just because it's a draft.
Sorry, for next steps for the vocabulary, are we going to work on Paul's?
We're going to issue, so as we discussed before, we'll issue a call for adoption for Paul's draft. Okay. Concurrently, we'll flesh out an issues list because I think the issues are applicable to whatever we choose as a starting point, and we can start discussing those issues as we just did.
Okay, so that's gonna happen later.
That's going to happen we'll do the call for adoption very soon, but that takes a little while to play out. We need to have that out on the list for at least about a week.
Okay, so, but then we can, maybe we can get ready by August?
That's the plan.
Much before that, yes, for the adoption.
Yeah. Oh, for adoption, yes. So yeah, we hopefully we'll have an adopted draft in a week, and we'll start iterating on that.
Oh, okay, so first we adopted, then we iterated.
We adopted that draft, and then we talk about the issues associated with it. We have new revisions of the draft, and it progresses until we feel that we've addressed all the issues that we want to address.
Okay. So we have already this bullet point list of issues. Does it make sense to maybe?
I can't hear you, Mira.
We have a bullet point list of issues.
Yeah. Does it make sense to maybe open GitHub issues?
I'm going to, yes.
Okay.
Yes. We'll
So
take care of that.
A few more words what the issues are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
If we have a bullet list of issues, we can start our attachment. Lots of people have wanted to talk about it kind of naturally, and we can always come back. I don't know if that has at the back of your head in the chair.
I think we start off on the list of issues and one point at a time. We haven't gone through it. I think
We've gone through two of them, basically.
We'll be here for past lunch tomorrow if we go to the morning.
I understand. I am also keenly aware that attachment is perhaps more contentious and technically simpler, to be honest, than the vocabulary issues.
Is that an argument for or against doing it?
Well, it's a good question, yeah. I think either way we want a time-bound attachment. We can maybe talk about how we want to do that. And at least maybe part of tomorrow will be attachment. Or that's the morning or afternoon. Okay, we'll figure it out.
Remember to keep the badge with you.
Lovely.
Thank you.
So back here, ready to start at 9:15 tomorrow morning. And yeah, enjoy your evenings.
Thanks all. Thanks for
Very much so. And folks, we'll see you as well.
And apparently the training work just begins to
Oh.
at least to Central and North. I can't speak to anywhere else. Okay. But I confirm that there are trainings starting about 10 minutes. Starting at 5.
I'll be at the same thing.
Excellent. So